Hey guys, how's it going? I've been reliving some fond memories across the surface and subterranean layers of Nirn. While doing so, I found a lot to discuss. So today, I want to share with you my findings on the dungeons of the Elder Scrolls. Before we're able to discuss the dungeons of the Elder Scrolls, we must first give that term a definition. I consider a dungeon in Elder Scrolls to be an interior location specifically created in order for players to explore, battle enemies, find loot, and possibly complete quests. When it comes to the Elder Scrolls series, there are 3 games that shine over the rest: Morrowind, Oblivion, and Skyrim. We will only be covering these titles, but it's not due to their popularity. When it comes to Arena, there are a few types of dungeons, and they all tend to generate the same way. They are either quest dungeons, crypts, or towers. The main quest dungeons are interesting, of course, but that is against the rules of the video, which I will outline in a moment. There are 18 types of dungeons in Daggerfall, which sounds great. However, most of these were randomly generated, barring again the main quest dungeons, which bans them from this video as well. The dungeons of ESO are, in my opinion, usually pretty fun, and many have very cool aesthetics and mechanics. That said, those dungeons are extremely large, and new ones are created all the time. They are also based on a technical term within the game that differs from delves, which would be considered dungeon-esque in terms of the primary series. Either of these options are handcrafted and, again, very cool, but the fact that they're continually being created sort of bars them from fair comparison to the dungeons of this video, which were made and released over 13 years ago, and, in the case of Morrowind's base game, 22 years ago. And so, we will be looking at the dungeons with the following rules. None of them can be connected to main quests. They must be generic, sizable, good representations of each type of dungeon, including the variety of creatures, loot, etc. Finally, these types must be distinct variations with given reason for their selection in the case that they seem similar. With all of that information in tow, let us begin our journey through the dungeons of the Elder Scrolls. In the 427th year of the Third Era, an unsuspecting prisoner landed aboard the docks at Seyda-Neen. Without any explanation, they were told that they were free to go, and asked to deliver a package to a man in Balmora. Little did they know that they would soon be tasked with saving the province, and perhaps, the world itself. The island of Vvardenfell makes up the main playable landmass of the Elder Scrolls III Morrowind. This land is fantastically strange with giant mushroom trees, massive bugs, a volcano, and plenty of other interesting phenomena. Across this land are many natural formations including caves and grottos, as well as historic landmarks such as Dunmer Strongholds, or even the ruins of the ancient Dwemer civilization. Within the same game are the capital city of
Mournhold, city of light, city of magic,
as well as the frosty isle of Solstheim. Between these, there are a selection of dungeons as well. With their additions, there are 14 distinct types of dungeons in Morrowind, with 3 of them being derivatives in the case of caves and mines. By the given definition, there are 363 dungeons in the game. This is a massive number, especially considering they were all handmade. There was a team of less than 40 people involved in the game's creation, and an even smaller percentage that worked on the dungeons. As such, it would make sense that some of them are similar to one another. The worst offender, I believe, is the pair of ancestral tombs between the Marin and Drinith families. Although this could easily be explained away as the Dunmer having a standard layout for their burial sites, just as we do with homes in real life. All of the dungeons you are about to see were created in something called the Elder Scrolls Construction Set. This editor will be discussed in greater detail after the Morrowind section is complete. For now, sit back and enjoy my experiences through the dungeons of the Elder Scrolls III. The Dunmer of Morrowind have a deeply rooted culture, simultaneously alien yet reflective of foreigner traditions. They live off the land, but herd bipedal lizards. They create their own homes, but sometimes in giant mushrooms. They work in mines, but harvest eggs instead of ore. One thing all men in Myr have in common is the inevitable outcome of life: passing away. The Dunmer have burial practices similar to other races, but protect the locations in unique ways that may offend others. Ancestral Tombs are the final resting places of Dunmer, who belong to a family of certain status. The resting spots are often guarded by the risen dead, many being ancient members of the families that use the tomb. In other times, the guard are bonewalkers, flesh atronachs ostensibly created from the remains of the last attempted grave robbers to enter the tomb. The Dunmer have always had a tricky relationship with necromancy. People are buried with valuable items as a sign of respect, or as a hopeful transference into the next realm. On Vvardenfell, there are 89 ancestral tombs. Many of the families for whom the tombs are named still exist on the island. The Baram tomb has one known member living on the island, Milar Baram. He's a slaver in the very first cave you may come across near Seyda-Neen, and one we will discuss later on. The largest example of this continued generation is the family of the Andrano Ancestral Tomb, of which there are 13 living residents on the island. The Baram tomb is located on an island north of Telarun, surrounded by muckbulbs and crushweed. Just outside are wild mud crabs. Standing guard at the entrance is a walking skeleton, a restless warrior of untold age. The tomb is created from limestone and digs down below the surface of the small island. The only light comes from the ever-blazing torches. Upon pedestals sit urns full of bone meal, the ash of the person resting there. The cremation may have been completed using ritualistic destruction magic, the fire element being something many Dunmer have natural talent in performing. Tapestries hang on the walls, a request of the old saints to aid the undead in watching over the tombs. Chests lay locked and trapped, daring any grave robber to try their luck. Offerings of ingredients and religious texts are laid near urns, a sign of respect and remembrance. Grave robbers are dealt with mercilessly, as their crimes are unforgivable. A central room props the ceiling with 4 pillars, aiding in the integrity of the tomb. A ritual summoning chamber exists where Dunmer can call out to their lost loved ones. Be it for counsel or curiosity, each summoning comes with a price. The whispers of the lost can be heard, competing with one another for an ear to listen. In the deepest segment of the tomb is another large room of urns. Offerings are laid out around a central platform, suggesting further rituals occur here. Perhaps this is where the newest guardians are raised. Throughout the tomb are many such guardians, made of bone, skin, or otherworldly flesh. In many cases, the denizens of Oblivion walk the halls, as a great number of Dunmer still worship the Daedric princes. As if the walking bones weren't enough, an attempted robber may come across a Daedroth, or even a Dremora, both fearsome enemies. This is sure to send them running, or, in the case of these adventurers, to the next realm. The design of the Ancestral Tombs is sincerely grounded, no pun intended. They're built into the earth, supported by pillars of limestone. Each is the result of digging tunnels, then filling them with walls. The rooms are very believable, often being of rectangular shapes with symmetrical layouts. The ease of this on level design was a boon for the times. The lighting sets the mood quite well. Torches burn forever, no doubt maintained in a magical way. They flicker, creating shadows through which a visitor must travel, almost calling to mind the brevity of life. This flash of existence. The enemies faced in these ruins also stand to reason. If one were to fall in battle, there's no doubt it could just be resurrected again at one of the ritual sites of the tomb. It conjures the question of whether these souls are of family members who take turns, or of unfortunate commoners and slaves. It has been stated that many are family members themselves, so I'm leaning toward the initial possibility. Placement of items makes near perfect sense. These objects are not of great import, a religious book here, a flower there. Though they could be used as potion ingredients or be sold to a shop, the player would only receive so much gold. The sermons of Vivek do fill a coin purse, but not every tomb has copies laying about. Further, the chests in these dungeons never have items of extreme cost. They're usually level-related enchanted items in them, oftentimes a dagger or other weapon. The rest are a mix of potions, common jewelry, a small amount of gold, and maybe an ingredient here or there. The enchanted weapons are a great choice, and I believe it to be intentional, as these chests are coded as being tomb dungeon specific. The reason for this would be that certain enemies, including the ancestral ghost, cannot be hurt by conventional weaponry. A blade must at least carry an enchantment, even if drained, in order to damage the occupants. From a lore perspective, this would not make sense, unless it is a failsafe of a new mage who cannot control his recent necromantic charge. Another bit of loot that we have not really considered are the ingredients placed about. These are sometimes rare plants from locations quite distant to the current location. This serves 2 functions. 1, showing that the person who placed them cares a lot about the deceased person. And 2, giving players a reason to check each pedestal in the case that something will be there. Apart from the ingredients placed about, there are always the drops from the enemy inhabitants. The most common of these is bone meal. I can never bring myself to take it from the urns, but from the reanimated skeletons themselves. These can be used to create potions of telekinesis, allowing the player to reach distant objects. It's great for thievery, and tombs are a consistent source of the material. How this applies to it being made of bone is somewhat curious. Perhaps it's another symbol of the connection between one distant plane of existence and another, or it's just a useful enchantment they wanted players to have common access to. Another good drop from enemies are soul gems. These can be used to trap the souls of creatures which have souls of various quality levels, that are apparently deemed by the gods themselves as scribs are always lesser and saints are always grand. They make sense to drop from these creatures as they must be used to bind souls to reanimated bones to begin with. However, they can't include the soul of the enemy that dropped them because they vary randomly, and not all levels of Soul Gem could contain, say, the soul of a Bone Lord. Speaking further of the Bone Walkers mentioned earlier, these creatures, specifically the Greater Bone Walker, can cause major problems for the player. They can sap your strength completely, requiring you to drop all of your items in order to escape. Because of this, it is imperative that you create or purchase potions that restore strength. I keep a few on hand at all times. Overall, I think the Ancestral Tombs have a mild source of loot, mostly in the form of magic materials, as well as a realistic design that gives a deeper understanding of Dunmer culture. As a kid, I used to be terrified of them. I could never make a career of grave robbing. Real quick, if you find yourself enjoying the video, or even learning something new, please consider liking the video and subscribing for more. This helps make my efforts worthwhile, and allows me to share this cool information with a wider range of viewers. Thank you for considering, and enjoy the rest of the video. Within the island of Vvardenfell are 92 caves, accessible through various means. They're sometimes filled with creatures or even Daedra. Other times they're inhabited by bandits or other ne'er-do-wells. Whatever may be inside, there is almost always something of value to be found. These caves may be formed through seismic activity, faults shifting, volcanic eruptions, etc. In many segments, caves are filled with water which begins to erode channels through time. Following these channels may lead to surprising results. Sometimes there are giant purple crystals that poke through the walls, emanating a purple glow. Just outside the starting town of Seyda-Neen, there is a cave called Adamasardis. It's nestled into the boulders along a hill, which it burrows into. The entrance is surrounded by mushrooms and sloth ferns, native flora of the region. Inside, a bandit has started a campfire. Caves are quite cold, as the air is basically not circulating. Using the bellows, she stoked it to the cozy flame seen here. Dropping from the ceiling are tendrils of some sort, suggesting the growth of a tree or large plant above, but as seen from the outside, this is not the case. There is also a boat and a set of oars, suggesting she and the other bandits rode here from somewhere. These bandits are not only thieves, but slavers. 3 unfortunate people are locked behind a gate, wearing enchanted bracers that prevent any kind of teleportation magic or magic in general. Further down the eroded halls is a cavern full of stalactites. Below it, the bandits have built a small dock for their stolen cash. You can imagine them having walked these crates all the way down here. Few people would trek this far into a cave. Beyond their smuggling base, the channel fills with water in 2 directions. One leads to a segment where mushrooms have begun to grow around snaking roots. The luminous russula and the violet copernus can be used to make potions of water breathing and water walking. If an alchemist were to pass through, they could use these to traverse the cave easier. Also, the copernus grows primarily from animal waste. Seeing as there are bones nearby, something must have been picked clean and left here. The animal might have left waste from this meal nearby, allowing the mushrooms to grow. A pauldron, some gold, and an enchanted black ring all lay in the pile. The bones could be human, but appear to be small. It could unfortunately be the bones of a child. The bones continue in the other direction, leading to another pauldron. Bones are here as well, as if segments of the body were taken apart. Maybe it was dragged off for later by whatever ate it. A stone stairway leads back to the central chamber. The other waterlogged path leads to a very small room. At the bottom is the skeleton of a fisherman or woman, as well as a rapier. Perhaps they were a pirate that somehow met a cruel fate here. With the last of their strength, they heaved this chest upon a ledge, hoping that someone in the future could at least make use of the spoils. If intruded upon, the bandits are quick to fight back. They carry the tools of their trade, including lockpicks and probes. One is a mage, an unusual profession for a thief. The final bandit uses throwing stars, but was unable to succeed where her allies had failed. Among the spoils of their crime are stashes of moon sugar, as well as its refined form, the drug known as skooma. Both of these are quite illegal on the island, as they have an incredibly addictive effect on all races, even the Khajiit, from whose land this is native to. Inside the crates on the dock are potions, alcohol, and some decent weaponry. There are also some enchanted pieces of jewelry, as well as a scroll that can unlock the maximum lock level of a door or container. The black ring from earlier may have belonged to one of their band, as it provides many benefits to thieves, allowing them to run faster, talk their way out of situations, and become more agile in the event that they are cornered and forced to fight. Luckily, the bandits were all carrying keys to the slave quarters. Using them, one can free the slaves and allow them to escape this painful life. Finally, the cavern with the fishermen leads to a very meager amount of loot. In this case, a cup and a small thimble of gold. Maybe the cup was an heirloom, having sentimental value. The layout of this cave makes some sense. However, there's no water source or channel from behind the slave quarters, which is the only way the cavern would make sense, as water flows down with gravity. The angled descent toward the waterlogged section is great and makes sense, as well as the hand-built ladders and walkways. You really can't imagine the crew hauling their goods down there one at a time while the others keep guard. The mushroom placement was good, being an eye-catcher and a realistic portrayal of where they would grow. In fact, over 90% of plant species have a symbiotic fungus that dwells around or within their roots. If you want to see more about the fungi of Morrowind, I did make a video on it a while back. I'll place a link here and in the description. Where I draw issues with this segment is the two spindly rock formations that are clearly there to be used as stairs. Even if water deposited on both sides of a previously existent rock mound, it would not erode in such a snake-like manner. It's even less likely that it would happen twice. Worse than this is the easy-out rock cropping that was created to allow a new player to escape in a circle. There are a few examples of this in Morrowind. This served primarily to ease new players into the idea of delving into a dungeon, and to show how the halls of said location could be traversed. This particular segment is not a great representation of cave dungeons, but the other segments are. The crystals mentioned before are actually not part of this cave, but of Iberdad, among others. These formations tend to appear when mages are working nearby. Some theorize that they grow in response to magical aura, and that they could be the source of local soul gems on the island. Seeing as how there are few caves with these structures, yet no lack of soul gems, I am not sure I subscribe to this idea. The cavern with the fishermen makes some sense, as air pockets do exist in real life. I wonder why there is a picnic basket with them, and why it doesn't float. The chest is also pretty lackluster, regardless of what level you are when you open it. The other crates, however, are actually pretty decent, especially early on, and serve as a great boost to your pocket when making a new character. Better yet, access to potions and scrolls is wonderful, and they only get better with your level. Each time you find a cave in Vvardenfell, you know you're going to get something good out of it. The inhabitants of this cave are smugglers, as mentioned before, and serve another purpose. If you find the moon sugar and skooma, then try to go back to Errol's trade house and sell it, he'll refuse to do business with you. In fact, there are very few people who will barter with you, should you have those on your person. So, other than teaching you how a dungeon in this game might function, it also shares a bit about the culture and business. Speaking of culture and business, this dungeon also introduces the slavery of the island. These people might be legally enslaved, a practice that the Empire turns a blind eye to since the Lalu bring them so much wealth. The fact that you can free them is great player agency, and also plays into a secret faction questline called the Twin Lamps, in which you carry this campaign even further. There's also this neat segment that teaches you how things are affected by your movement between mediums. If you carry one of the many torches as you move into the water, it'll snuff out completely, becoming a useless paperweight in your inventory. This cave and many others serve as interesting places in which you can pick up bits of lore as well as experience the combat and exploration that was intended for the heroic adventurer. Although the Empire has recently come under control of certain parts of the province, they lack yet the power to remove certain traditions. One of these is Daedra worship, the following of otherworldly entities with suspect or downright evil intentions for the mortal realm. Followers devote their lives to patrons, building shrines where they can, often in far-off or difficult-to-reach locations. There are 40 such Daedric Shrines on the island of Vvardenfell. Most of these are split between the 4 Daedric princes, including Malakath, Mehrunes Dagon, Molag Bal, and Sheogorath. These 4 are called the Bad Daedra, or the 4 Corners of the House of Troubles, as they would not bend to the will of the tribunal deities. This caused much infighting amongst the Dunmer, which still lasts today, as the tribunal temple punishes their worship by law. Interestingly enough, the Imperials will join the Ordinators and Buoyant Armigers on occasional crusades to these ruins in order to vanquish a perceived common threat. These ruins are created from an unknown material that seems to be intricately carved blocks of metal. Runes line every surface, showing the devotion of the architects to whichever prince they worship. The buildings are strewn about with no clear rhyme or reason. This is fitting of Daedric worship, seeing as how it is quite chaotic in nature. There are often subterranean segments of these shrines, inside which are worshippers and Daedric denizens of the patron prince. A good example of a Daedric ruin is Bal-Ur, which translates to the first stone. For what reason it was named this, there is no clear answer. As we survey the exterior landscape of this location, we can see 2 followers strolling about. Nearby are wild owlets, bipedal lizard-like creatures with a great gaping maw. A scamp, one of the lowest forms of Daedra, stalks the northern path from the ruins. Inside the structure are jagged shapes of twisted metal, braziers flaming, and a large pool of lava maintained in the central basin. The stones of the floor are flat, cut into straightened shapes of rectangles and squares. Nords stand on the first floor, guarding the site from non-believers. On the second floor is a pair of Dremora, eager to butcher any trespassers. They are at home here, standing in the aura of their master, able to kill without warrant. Hanging above the central lava basin are what seem to be hanging mace balls, hollow and spewing with green essence. What purpose these serve, it's hard to guess. Knowing the Daedra, this is probably some form of poison that is being disseminated throughout the ruin. Taking a doorway to a subterranean layer of the building, we can see a large room used as storage and sleeping quarters of the mortal inhabitants. The room soon leads into a cave which routes through caverns and into a large chamber filled with lava. A golden saint keeps watch, ever vigilant and ready for combat. Lighting up a spindly rock formation, an adventurer will come across the great form of Molag Bal, the Daedric Prince of Domination. This prince also harbors a secret cure for vampirism, but it comes with a hefty price. Standing near his statue is a believer, clad in exquisite robes, despite the great heat of the room. Just behind her is the table of offerings, boasting a glass helmet and halberd, a Daedric heart, and many types of gems. Up high is a hidden cache of items stored within a locked chest and some urns. For the deliberate adventurer, these ruins harbor plenty to discover, so long as they can defeat some of Oblivion's finest warriors. The layout of these ruins makes some sense. Drawing from the chaos of the Daedric princes themselves, they are always strewn about. It's as if Molag Bal had shaken up the pieces as dice in his great clawed hands, releasing them upon the surface of Nirn to whatever result may come. The interiors are reverent halls with high ceilings, suggesting that levitation or some other form of magic must have been used to create these upper levels. In fact, one cannot reach the upper level with Dremora unless they use some form of levitation magic. This means that they would be unable to rest in this room to regain health, seeing as the Dremora would notice them but never become reachable. The Nords are an interesting choice. Most Nords do not believe in the Daedra, or at least do not worship them. These are an odd case, and the group of them is a stark difference in visual tone from the Dunmer believers frequenting the ruins. They carry weapons and armor of little value, as well as a skill book worth 300 gold. Moving into the caverns, we can rummage through the storage area to find many ingredients of various types. There are also soul gems and random weapons thrown into crates. The Dremora are quick to shield themselves from the effects of normal weaponry. They summon masterfully crafted staves with which to fight their battles, drawing an advantage at will. If defeated, their hearts can be used to make potions of Nidai or potions of Restore Magica, which makes a little more sense seeing as these are beings of a magical nature. Bone Lords exist in these ruins as well, perhaps to aid in the capture of souls for some evil purpose. What are far more impressive than either of the previous two enemies are the Golden Saints, warriors of great strength and constitution. They brandish exquisitely crafted weapons and shields, using them quite well against an invading force. If bested, their armaments can be taken and sold for thousands of gold per piece. Though not found at every ruin, one may also find other creatures of Oblivion, including the dinosaur-like Clanfear with shielded heads, sharp beaks, and wicked claws. The voracious Hunger, ready to sap all of one's life force through a long, sharp tongue. The Ogrim, a vast and ungainly beast with a ferocious swing. The Winged Twilight, sisters and rivals of the Golden Saints, they need no weapons, instead flying toward their foes to rend them with taloned feet or impale them with a bladed tail. And finally, the Atronachs of Flame, Frost, and Storm, which wield their elements more naturally than any mage could hope to achieve. The lava chamber is very cool. It also contains my first nitpick of the dungeon's layout, which is another thin rock bridge that winds to the perfect placement of the Molag Bal statue. This one may get a pass though, as the surrounding areas were all carved out by believers or minions, meaning this may also have been. It would be in keeping with the chaotic nature of architecture these ruins are known for. The statue of Molag Bal is awesome. This depiction of him as a dragon-faced beast with massive claws is so interesting, especially learning how he would come to be represented in future titles. The offering table below him holds items of great value and suggests pilgrimages from many reverent believers. The Daedra heart on a plate also hints at how little he must care for his minions, as one of them died just for this to exist. On the topic of these offerings, the gems placed at Daedric Shrines are usually unique items. If taken, they are supposed to spawn a Dremora behind you that will surprise you with a battle you weren't mentally prepared for. This is a neat trick, but one that did not happen to be employed in this dungeon. If I had to guess a reason, I would say that the spawning of a Dremora could cause a cluster of battle, potentially leading to the accidental death of the robed believer. If that happened, a player afflicted with vampirism would not be able to speak with her and begin the quest for a cure. This high up ledge with loot provides some useful and expensive scrolls, but not much else. It's a good method of teaching players that they will be rewarded for exploration. Most dungeons of the future titles seem to lack these details, assuming players want to complete a dungeon and not have to check every little corner for what may or may not exist there. I certainly prefer the hunt. As for why these items were placed here, it could be the secret stash of the robed believer from before. Perhaps she is skilled in levitation magic and uses these scrolls to defend the shrine. She may also be the only one able to reach the higher floor in the central chamber, which could explain how the Dremora were summoned up there. Daedric Ruins in general are very interesting places to visit, often associated with a Daedric quest of some sort. They sometimes have even better loot than what was seen here. provide a great challenge with the caliber of enemies they host, and teach players a lot about the lore of Daedra, as well as why their followers are viewed with such disdain. As of the 427th year of the Third Era, Morrowind plays host to 5 great houses: Indoril, Redoran, Telvanni, Lolu, and Dress. This was not always the case, however. Long in the past, before the Tribunal took power, there were many more houses. They each lived on the land, maintaining their positions and livelihoods across the surface. While holding these locations, they were often attacked by raids from different races, primarily including the Nords. To solve the problem once and for all, the different houses built strongholds, of which there are 11 remaining today. These strongholds proved to strengthen their defenses immensely, allowing the old houses to be rid of the Nord raids once and for all. This was far in the past, however. Once the Tribunal crowned themselves and declared Vvardenfell a religious holy ground, the great houses consolidated into those we recognize today. As such, these strongholds were abandoned in favor of more deferential locations, such as the metropolis of Vivec City. Here, the people of Vvardenfell could group up in greater numbers, living more peaceful lives under a divine ruler. The strongholds remained empty for some time, gathering dust and cobwebs. Eventually, different groups found and entered the uncontested space, converting them to bases for their various goals. These include all manner of slavers, raiders, Daedra worshippers, etc. To gain a better understanding of these strongholds, we should visit one. This one is called Andazrith, most likely named after one of the old houses. It's situated in the Westgash region and plays host to a gang of bandits. The outer walls are thick, made of what seems to be stone mixed with some sort of thatching. Wooden beams support the walls, reaching high above the flat surface of the stronghold. That flat surface acts as a sort of ziggurat made to prop up 2 distinct buildings. There are occasional slit windows in the thatching, providing an area from which the inhabitants can aim their bows and remove threats. These are locked and opened only from the inside, providing additional security. I can imagine bands of Nords charging the strongholds, reaching the front door before being skewered with arrows. The Dunmer could then open their doors, loot the bodies of materials, and throw the remains to the creatures of the Ashen Wastes. Either that, or they could resurrect them and build up their forces. A very unique feature of these strongholds are the propylon chambers. 2 pedestals exist, making use of otherworldly magic. A central stone is carved with the name of another stronghold written in Daedric, and is surrounded by strange red rays whipping about. The magic reaches and twists around crystals quite similar to those seen in some of the caves on the island. If someone steps upon the pedestal and holds a resonant stone, they can use the chambers to teleport to another stronghold somewhere else on the island. It calls to mind the question of secret keeping. How did the Dunmer make sure that no Nord ever learned of the magic? Was there an appointed secret keeper? Is this the reason, as of year 427 in the Third Era, that there is only a single resonant stone per stronghold? Or were there a great many such stones in the past that at one point were destroyed? Imagining a scenario once more, say that the Nords were able to completely overwhelm one of the strongholds through sheer force and number. They could interrogate captured Dunmer, or even just find a well-decorated dark elf upon whom was a strange stone. Although typically averse to magic, I could see a leading Nord wanting to investigate the potential connection to the magical room outside. What if he were to carry the stone, step on a pedestal, and teleport to an unsuspecting stronghold? Then he could return with his band of Nords and charge the next target with advantage. As far as we know in the actual lore, this never did occur. However, just because there was no mention of it does not mean it was impossible. There may also have been the fact that the Dunmer considered this a possibility, and that's why there's only 1 stone per location, meaning that only 1 person could travel to and fro at any given time, preventing such an onslaught. It would, however, still allow a trespasser to learn of the other locations, and knowledge is dangerous. The inner halls of the stronghold are somewhat creepy, lit only by fire and walled by cold stone brick. The contrast of the large stones and wooden beams creates a really nice and believable color balance. Every so often a room is cut into the center, serving as a living space, sparring corridors, or kitchen. Though bandits now live in the stronghold, they maintain the previous amenities, and one can imagine it being a fairly comfortable way to live for the old houses. There are, of course, occasional pests, such as giant rats, but those could easily be dealt with. In one room of this stronghold is a group of bodies, all belonging to warriors of House Redoran. This suggests that the bandits must have overwhelmed this crew that was watching the stronghold for potential acquisition by the Great House. The fact that their armor remains upon them is a clear message from the bandits to anyone who may see the room. We are not to be messed with. Another layer of this signal could be of great disrespect, seeing as how bandits who are ultimately fueled by the hunt for money did not take and sell the armors of their victims. This creates a strong message indeed. Larger rooms in the stronghold are propped up by thick pillars made of wood. This calls to question, where is the wood from? These all appear to be singular trunks from some sort of tree, but no flora of such a shape exists nearby. Perhaps they lug trees from the nearby bitter coast, then cut them into these shapes. If so, one would imagine that the trees of the swamps would be young growth, and not the old growth that we see today. This would suggest that they made the more difficult trek to the West Gas region in order to find lumber. It is less likely, as it would be more difficult, but perhaps that type of wood is just sturdier. It's interesting to see the different rooms of the stronghold still in use today. If one were a fly on the wall, they would never guess these people were bandits. They would assume that they simply lived here, existing and studying just like anyone else. I really enjoy the fact that these structures have such clear lore, and that the interior cells are formed in a realistic way that matches their external shape. The attack slits are also very cool, and I had never noticed the way they open up to the exterior. When I was younger, I used to think these were doors leading to other sections I just couldn't open, but this makes much more sense. The number of bandits in this stronghold is quite large, and each of them provide a decent fight. Their loot is not much to boast of, but it does include useful tools such as lockpicks and probes. In storage chests are the usual assortment of dishes, ingredients, and sometimes randomly generated enchanted items. Upon the corpses of the fallen Redoran Guard are expensive amulets and clothing, as well as full suits of Godulon bone mold armor, which is a great find for any early game player. They're also worth a decent sum and would be worth collecting for a later sale. The living quarters of the stronghold now hold chests of clothing, small sums of gold, and more. How much of this belonged to the original inhabitants, it's hard to say. There's also this really nice table where a bandit was researching magic and even looking into the history of dragon breaks, which are basically different timelines in the Elder Scrolls universe. It's a shame to kill someone with such curiosity, but hey, he attacked first. In this room were some conveniently generated magic items, as well as some drugs, scrolls, and armaments. Using the newfound gear, I was able to both lock and unlock any container I saw. Even the cloth bags could be locked. This duo here are both wearing chitin armor and were probably sparring on the map behind them. Unfortunately, they did not train quite hard enough. I also wonder who was sleeping in this room while the other trained, as there is a great big bed on the eastern wall. As if being bandits wasn't bad enough, there's evidence of these people being followers of the Sixth House, to which belongs Dagoth and his twisted minions. These people were more of a danger than thought prior. On the rooftop outside, 3 bandits use ranged attacks to defend the base. That, and probably to shoot at prey items from the safe walls of the stronghold. When it comes to the overall loot of the strongholds, there's quite a bit to be excited about. Other than the multitude of items to sell, there are also randomly generated containers of enchanted magical items which, for a large segment of the game, do prove beneficial in many scenarios. The number of bandits easily multiplies the value of their armament, and the fact that they have stored all their criminal possessions allows for easy access and redistribution into the economy by the player. For the victims, however, it would be a little like finding your stolen Xbox at a pawn shop. These strongholds are quite fun to traverse, and each has a unique interior layout. There's also the matter of the propylon indexes, which can often be found within the stronghold itself. There are cases where they are found elsewhere, but they still open one of a few types of fast travel that the player can make use of, even better so if they have the Master Index plugin, which combines all indices into one. Although initially difficult to travel to, I think all the strongholds are worth visiting and clearing. You'll make tons of money, discover some interesting lore, and open up a branch of travel that fills in much of the out-of-circuit map. An ancient race of dwarves used to populate many locations in Tamriel. They were known as the Dwemer, or the Deep Elves. Masters of magic and architecture, they knew few bounds. This manifests most clearly in the fact that, one day, they simply disappeared. Despite the best guesses of scholars throughout Nirn, there has never been a definitive answer on what happened. Though they are long gone, monuments to their intellect and creativity still stand the test of time. There are massive towers, ballista, statues, and more notably, deep structures in which the Dwemer used to live and work. Within the halls still roam some of their creations, automatons of peculiar shape and nature. Different forms of technology are present which continue to elude the talents of the Dunmer and Vvardenfell, including what seems to be some sort of electric system. Many of these ruins are left abandoned, hosting none other than the lifeless machines that wander endlessly, seemingly requiring no fuel or charging to maintain their perpetual circuits. The only sound comes from whirring machinery and settling metal. Diving into these ruins can reveal much about the Dwemer, but also valuable treasures. As they often mined alongside other projects, there remains crates of gems and metal for the daring adventurer to acquire. This has often been the end of a foolish traveler, though some of these ruins now house different groups of people, such as bandits and even vampire clans. There are 23 conspicuous Dwemer ruins on the island of Vvardenfell. Situated in the Sheagorad region, the Dwemer Ruins of Mazulev stand tall. Towers lean this way and that, the result of seismic and volcanic activity no doubt. Regardless of their current arrangement, each building is imposing, a testament to the artistry of their long-gone creators. Smokestacks exist all around the ruins, spewing steam into the air. Many are surrounded by lava, a common source of power within the ruins. There are occasional windows made of green glass, no doubt made from the naturally formed minerals of the island. A statue of a dwarven warrior stands perpetually ready for battle. Many pipes and structural braces are etched with Dwemer writing that we will translate later on. The halls of the Dwemer Ruins are lit by some sort of magical electricity as mentioned before. These yellow bulbs glow over doorways, leading the traveler through circular portals. All along the walls are the same etchings from before. A great machine of unknowable purpose spins a turbine through steam. Along the walls are shelves full of Dwemer dishes, such as mugs and goblets. Their sale is strictly prohibited by the Empire, leading some to smuggle them for coin. The idea behind this law is considered to be that the Empire wants full control of the objects, should their illicit magical abilities one day be unlocked. Though this concerns things like tubes and coherers, it seems dishes are also controlled. Occasionally one can find ancient schematics of machines planned to be built by the Dwemer. These are useless to those without the knowledge of tonal architecture, but still fetch a hefty price. Here we see a boiler room full of extra cogs and cycling machinery. An ancient book called the Egg of Time rests on a table nearby. There are great pipes within a pool of lava, channeling the molten material for some unknown purpose. There are many orcs that have taken up residence in this particular ruin. These smugglers are most likely plundering for the many valuables resting here. If defeated in battle, the smugglers also drop expensive pieces of armor. The many locked and trapped doors require players to be talented or persistent in their efforts to find loot. Of course, there are also keys which can bypass these issues. Inside chests are ancient pieces of currency, armor, and machinery that are worth a fair sum of money. Looking at the Egg of Time, we see images of Sunder and Keening, two masterfully forged weapons created by Kagranak, as well as the Heart of Lorkhan in the center. Translating these texts leads to gibberish, which may or may not be encoded by the author for Dwemer eyes only. While on the subject of translation, we can see that the runes on the piping of Dwemer Ruins all translate to Worm God, the nickname of Gary Noonan, one of the developers that worked on the ruins. Further, Gary wrote something on the doorways that was in memory of his father, and it reads, "In loving memory, Gary Noonan Sr." Although the loot of the enemies was nothing to write home about, the numerous gems and ancient pieces of Dwemer civilization are more than cool. The layout of the dungeon is mostly subterranean, and the use of certain machines and such to create interesting questions, mostly of why and how, was a good choice to add to the mystery of the Dwemer's existence. Since this dungeon was an example of one inhabited by people, I also wanted to show one inhabited by machines. One of 6 Dwemer citadels located within the Ghost Gate, the ruins of Bethanchant are often obscured by blight storms. The bridge constructed to enter the dungeon has been broken apart by time, with large gaps between segments. Inside are numerous Dwemer animunculi, one of the more notable being its Centurion Sphere. This automaton can condense into a ball for easier movement, and boasts a shield and extendable lance from its arm. It uses one glass eye to seemingly locate targets. The large constructs are Steam Centurions, great hulking masses of metal which have mace balls for arms. Their eyes are also made of green volcanic glass that somehow senses an intruder's presence. As they are felled, they hit the ground with force. There also exist small spider centurions, insectoid creatures, seeing as they have 6 legs total. Their central structure is a confusing mass of what seems to be flexible metal, bending and releasing steam as necessary. A dwarven spectre roams the lower halls, for some reason left behind by its brethren. Beyond him are more steam machines of curious nature, as well as containers of expensive ancient materials. These halls, being inhabited by nothing but brainless automatons, is simultaneously interesting and sad. It's not as though they feel emotion, but one wonders if their magically infused systems may be awaiting maintenance, or at least the return of a master to serve. A robot without a purpose is a conundrum. Since this segment had multiple locations, the realism judgments and such are kind of all over the place, so I apologize for the lack of structure. This dungeon is unique in the way that it is the only Dwemer ruin not inhabited by the 6th house within the confines of the Ghost Gate. The automatons are all very interesting and fun to fight, especially due to their animations, which seem to be of higher quality than many other combatants in the game. I also sincerely love the idea of ancient civilizations in video games. The Dwemer are a highly advanced race that simply disappeared with no clear answer as to why. Even in ancient times, they were so beyond any race in terms of technology and magic today. One of my recent characters is a Dwemer researcher and has a small trophy room of yet-to-be-organized gear he has found in his travels. Random aside, but this character, Darren Nivos, is actually part of a short book series I'm working on revolving around the game. I may speak more on that in the future when I complete the first story, which is over halfway finished. Back to the dungeons, the loot in these ruins is fantastic. Not only can you find decent enchanted gear, expensive antiques and rare dwarven armors, but you can also find a host of rare ingredients such as scrap metal and gems. There are a handful of useful potions you can make with these, including potions of lightning shield from scrap metal and crab meat, restoration of intelligence with scrap metal and rubies, which matches thematically as a connection to the Dwemer, a potion of feather, which makes for easy loot shipping, and finally, magic fortification from emeralds and salt rice. All of these potions are quite useful, and even better, they can be sold for a great sum of gold to vendors across the island. Apart from my bias toward enjoying the Dwemer Ruins intrinsically, I always find them to be quite lucrative and worth a visit. Beneath the waters of Vvardenfell are ancient caves, formed in similar ways to their terrestrial counterparts. In these, however, are aquatic creatures and beings that have found refuge within the darkness. In the Sheogorid region lies the entrance to the Ilanipu Grotto. By drinking of water-breathing potions, or holding your breath and hoping, you can open the man-made door and enter the murky depths. The waters of the grotto contain tall-growing plants, green and vibrant regardless of a lack of sunlight. A blue glow emits from some unknown source. Bubbles rise occasionally as collops, or clams, sit nearby. Some of the plants grow outside of water as well, meaning they must have roots digging down into the substrate to gather the necessary moisture. There are a few giant collops in the grotto, dwarfing the common variety. The oblivious adventurer may miss them on the first pass, but there are two other heroes who have suffered ill fates within this cave. Both are dead. Why they came here, no one knows. Also in the water are slaughterfish, great-fanged beasts of extreme speed. If not dealt with quickly, they could bite through armor, causing major lacerations. There are 11 grottos on the island, most of which boasting little to no loot to speak of. There are some that provide major artifacts, but those are outliers for sure. The two bodies in this location offer armor and weapons to sell, but that's about it. More interesting are the collops and slaughterfish. The ingredients from these sources offer something that is actually valuable and relevant to the dungeons themselves. If combined with Kwama Cuddle, the scales of the slaughterfish grant the ability to walk on water, saving much time in travel, as well as, ironically, protecting the drinker from slaughterfish themselves, as they cannot attack the adventurer if they're out of the water. I may go into deeper detail on these fish in a future video, but something to note here is that they are not bottom feeders, as is evident by their jaw structure. This would mean they expect prey to be ahead of them or fall from above. I assume in the open waters outside that they would eat bugs or birds that rest on the surface, or even smaller slaughterfish. But here, deep in a dark cave, I have no clue what they'd eat other than the unapparent insect. I also wonder how the cave slaughterfish is exactly the same as the free-swimming species outdoors. In reality, creatures that call caves home tend not to waste energy applying camouflage coloration. No one would see it. So perhaps these fish were brought in here and bred by one of the dying adventurers. The other interesting ingredient is the pearl, which can be combined with Kwama Cuddle to create a potion of water breathing. This would allow an adventurer to travel through grottos free of worry. Mostly. They can also mix with ashiums, a staple crop of the island, to produce potions that prevent common diseases. The man-made door calls to question the purpose of this find. In real life, if a cave such as this is found, no one wastes time creating a door to it unless they're protecting something. Perhaps an endangered species, which is common in the case of bats and salamanders. Or, more likely, maybe someone was using this site as a pearl farm. Which would make sense, as it should also be mentioned that pearls are worth 500 gold per pound. Perhaps our ill-fated adventurers sought to enhance their pocketbooks. Most grottos do not contain much in the way of loot, or even people, but they're worth exploring in the off chance that they do. In fact, as mentioned, some of the best items in the game can only be found within them. Beyond that point, they are simply interesting natural phenomena. There are many sources of income for the inhabitants of Vvardenfell. These include farming, general stores, luxury boutiques, and so on. One of the primary revenue streams for the island people is mining. To make this section easier to explain, I'll divide the topic of mines into multiple headings. First, there are two distinct types of mines on the island. One is a Kwama Egg Mine, which I will describe in a moment. The other type is an ore mine, with which many are familiar. Of those ore mines, there are three types in Vvardenfell, including ebony, glass, and diamond. Looking at the Kwama Egg Mine, a tourist would initially be confused. What is an egg mine? How can you mine eggs? Well, there's a species of creatures called Kwama. These are bug-like beings with various forms reminiscent of insects. Following that trend, there's a Kwama queen which lays many eggs inside the nest. These eggs are deposited throughout the cavernous nest of the Kwama. Dunmer citizens learned that the eggs were quite tasty, and as they're quite large, they're very efficient in meals, even providing magical restoration of common fatigue. Thus, some Dunmer began investigating the tunnels in order to set up operations in which they would gather some eggs now and then. Over time, the Kwama recognized that the Dunmer weren't there to kill them. They seemed to be ignorant to the fact that any eggs were missing, as miners would leave enough for the colony to maintain its numbers. So then it was that the Kwama would become used to the scent of the miners, and thus a large industry was born. There are 32 Kwama Egg Mines on Vvardenfell. Most of them have been found but ultimately unexplored, as the few that are controlled produce more than enough food and profit. Using the Hawaii mine as an example, we can witness the peaceful existence of Kwama and miners side by side. Other than the egg mine trade, the most interesting thing about these mines is the Kwama themselves. They begin as a larval form, a scrib which seems to be all but helpless. If you have the misfortune of accidentally harming one, it will use a paralyzing toxin to lock you in place as it bites furiously. Left alone, they are peaceful prey that wander in search of food. In many cases, it seems those on the surface are simply lost. The next form is the Kwama Forager. These foragers scour the surface with intent to find food and new places for the colony to move into. They're quite dangerous to smaller insects and creatures, but not much to the adventurer. Another peaceful form of Kwama is the Worker. They move around as mobile shovels for the Kwama colony. Using their sharpened faces, they dig tunnels to further expand the cavernous nest. Their antennae may be used to feel shifts in the rock, or maybe to sense danger. They are most often a docile creature, but will attack if threatened. Next are the Kwama Warriors, the fierce, upright soldiers that will defend the queen at all cost. These can be quite dangerous, spewing poison that will rot the armor and skin of the unwary adventurer. Some of them can also use magic, sending shockwaves of electricity to aid in defense of the brood. Finally, we have the Kwama Queen. Completely stationary, this creature will never move, and is instead assisted by the workers. As it lays eggs, the workers move them to different locations throughout the cavern, where they form root-like structures in the ground, perhaps to sap out nutrients locked within the substrate. The queen can attack with a swivel of the head, but it has very short range and is ultimately helpless. Hence, the warriors are typically found nearby. Other than the eggs, Kwama mines are basically devoid of treasure, at least in the typical sense. Despite their role as a staple food on the island, they don't sell for very much at general stores. They have other value in the form of potion ingredients. The two varieties of eggs are small and large. The size difference matters here, as the larger eggs have had more time to gather nutrients and thus have more to offer in terms of magical effects. The small Kwama egg, when combined with salt rice, can create potions to restore fatigue, the solid pick-me-up if one becomes tired. Sleepiness carries a heavy price in the wilds of Morrowind, as the restless adventurer will miss attacks more often, run slower, and generally be less effective at their goals. If combined with shulk resin, the large Kwama eggs can produce a tonic of health fortification, raising the maximum number of hit points that a player can use to withstand damage. These sizable eggs can also mix with ebony ore fragments in order to create potions of Frost Shield, which surrounds the wearer in a magical aura, blocking the effects of ice damage. Should the Kwama creatures be killed, they will release a coagulated substance from their beaks, known as Cuttle. As mentioned in the prior section, it can be combined with scales of pearls to create potions of water walking or water breathing respectively. Why the Kwama Cuttle would aid in these effects is unknown. As largely subterranean creatures, maybe they are averse to water, and perhaps they could spit out this substance, as bugs do, to block crevices through which rainwater is filtering into their caverns. This could make sense, allowing the steps of the potion user to repulse the water, thus creating buoyance. As for how it allows them to breathe water, maybe the viscous Cuttle creates an air pocket that the user breathes within. Your theories are as good as mine. The caverns of these animals are believable and serve to highlight the great number of bug-like creatures that call Vvardenfell home. Whenever I first experienced an egg mine, it felt as though I were shrunk and stepped into an anthill, following the twists and turns, avoiding the denizens as they chase the intruder. There are unique locations that help to set the dungeons of Morrowind apart from those of other regions, as these creatures are endemic to the province. Before moving on from this segment, I also wanted to point out something about their life stages. Firstly, the scrib looks nothing like any of the other creatures. In fact, it's the only one that could be considered an insectoid, as it has 3 pairs of legs instead of 2 like all the following stages. It also has completely different coloration, which is realistic, as many grubs in larval stages of insects in real life are somewhat translucent. They exist largely in the dark, and only a small ratio of larvae survive to adulthood anyway, so camouflage isn't invested in. At some point, the scribs lose their legs and become foragers, or that is what is generally accepted. They do look more like the other stages, so that would make sense. This makes me wonder, what if the scribs are not actually related to the Kwama, but are some other kind of species in a symbiotic relationship with them? Later titles, namely ESO, have attempted to bridge this gap by homogenizing the appearance of the scribs with other stages of Kwama. But as of the 3rd era, which comes later than that game, and is the time this game is set in, the scribs look very different. It's an interesting thought experiment, and is mostly conjured by the idea of losing legs throughout the life cycle. Moving on to the foragers, they have become limbless worms with 3 eyes and a circular mouth. It would be easy as a big fan of the Dune series to make connections, many of which are warranted and spoken of by the developers themselves, but I'll try to avoid it. The foragers then somehow become Kwama workers, which have 4 legs and have developed the spade-like face. There are what seem to be 2 eyes, but that cannot be right, as we'll discuss further. They must use their tendrils as sensory organs, and the gaps in their shovel must accept bits of detritus that they eat in order to survive. Now, here's where things get weird. The Kwama warriors change body plans completely, becoming the only life stage to stand upright. They have the body of a worker, but flipped, with a head coming out of the previous rear of the body. This head is identical to the body of a forager. The tail at the previous head end is also that of a forager. Although considered a life stage, it would seem that a worker instead allowed 2 foragers to attach themselves, one at either end. Then it learned to walk on its front feet, using the back 2 as melee weapons. The act of allowing a forager to enter either end is very curious and bizarre. Although this somehow grants the warrior, which may be considered a class of sorts, the ability to use magic. This of course is all conjecture, as it is considered by official sources to be a life stage instead of an amalgam of colonial and symbiotic individuals. To me, that only conjures more questions. If that's the case, then why would the body grow in reverse of all the energy put toward the spade-like front? Is the Kwama forager-like head actually one long worm, with the tail exiting from the bottom? A single entity that was always within the worker and simply expanded over its growth cycle, using that previous exoskeleton as armor? It is all very confusing and bizarre, but one of the many reasons I find the Kwama so interesting. Last but not least is the Queen. Recall that I mentioned these dots on the worker could not be eyes. The reason is, if not implied by the last discussion, that the body has both completely shifted direction in terms of growth, as well as gained a triplicate set of eyes through which to observe the world, rendering those previous eyes useless. I would say they could be used to survey blind spots, but that's not the case, as on the warrior they would only inspect the ground, and on the Queen they would be blocked by the egg sac protruding from the abdomen. Again, very odd, but fascinating as well. With that, we conclude our discussion on the very unique egg mines of Vvardenfell. Now, onto something a little more familiar. On the eastern slope of Red Mountain is an unassuming wooden door dug straight into the rock. Inside is an ore mine guarded by Imperials and staffed by Dunmer miners. Of primary interest to this crew is the purple mineral called ebony. In raw form, this ore is worth 20 gold per pound and typically weighs around 10 pounds per chunk. This is, of course, quite valuable. Not only can it be used for robust armor and jewelry, but one could also make potions from it to cure poison, which could be the difference between life and death. It might be useful to make potions from it before braving a Kwama mine, for instance. For all of the above reasons, these mines are clearly lucrative and well worked. You can also take your ebony supplies to a man named Bowles Dalen in Mournhold, and he will forge a full set of armor for you. This is great for meritocratic purposes, regardless of whether or not your ebony was legally sourced. The caverns of these mines are filled with strange shapes, roughly spherical, and from which ebony ore protrudes. Wooden support beams cross the ceiling at key structural points. These halls are also quite hot, with lava from the nearby Red Mountain coursing throughout the lower segments. The Elithpal mine is one of 6 such ebony mines on the island. All of them surround Red Mountain, which makes sense as the ore is derived from lava, at least in this universe. Ebony as we know it comes from the dark hardwood of trees within the Diosporos genus. It could be petrified, as with any wood, but this is not what is explicitly stated as its generative process in the Elder Scrolls. Here, it's formed through rapid cooling of magma like volcanic glass, more akin to obsidian, which, in similar taste, is often misrepresented as being a strong material in video games. In real life, it can be snapped by hand. It's also apparently sharper than a surgical blade, which explains its use in weaponry, to say nothing more of the cost. A final note on this mine is that the crew is led by a wood elf named Dangor, which could be pronounced Danger, as he is but a few steps from becoming a molten heap. This man's canonical function within this mine is to provide Flynn, a type of alcohol, to the miners, in hopes that it will improve morale. If the player helps bring a shipment here from the Fighters Guild, the crew will be able to get drunk, swing pickaxes, stumble around lava, and harvest an incredibly heavy and sharp mineral. Sounds safe to me. Further south along the Ghost Gate is another type of mine. Untold years of volcanic activity have created glass formations within the caves of the island. The technical name for this material is malachite, but for ease of discussion, it is typically just called glass. After it was discovered, people took some to see what they could fashion from it. As it turns out, the glass is lightweight but decently durable. It's also quite flexible. With these facts in mind, smiths were able to forge armor and weapons from the material. This ore, if you can call it that, is also used to create ceremonial pieces in High Elven design. Because of these reasons, the glass is pretty lucrative. In fact, even more so than ebony, being worth 100 gold per pound and usually coming in 2-pound chunks. Raw glass mines are well guarded and heavily worked. Of the 5 glass mines on the island, many are close to or within the Ghost Gate at the center. This location is quite dangerous, rife with treacherous creatures infected with blight disease, or worse. However, the Ayleid mine is flush with glass deposits, and hence it is fully populated regardless of the issues. The glass itself is green and seems to almost glow. It has an alchemical property that can create a fire shield potion. This is neat, as the material is created by heat itself. It would also bode well for the miners and guards if they had an alchemist on hand, as there's much lava nearby. The Ayleid glass mine is pretty spacious and quite cool from an exploratory perspective. Like the other 4 mines, this one is situated around Red Mountain. The Yasu glass mine is within the Ghost Gate, which is an even more dangerous location. When it comes to the working aspect, I like the conveyor cart system the miners have set up. It looks quite stable and efficient. Apart from this, the mine is similar to those of the other ore types, but serves to bring more lore and world building to the island. Over the hills to the northeast of Caldera is the Abalin mine. It's the only mine on the province to boast diamond ore. The Imperials and House Lalu run the place, and the diamonds are shared, though the ratio is unknown. The values of the other 2 ore types pale in comparison to that of the diamond. It's worth 1,250 gold per pound, and typically comes in pieces of less than a quarter pound. The mine consists of one large cavern with many stalagmites around which a conveyor rail is built. This operation seems to be in a fledgling state, as there aren't many miners or tools nearby. On the topic of usage, diamonds can be found in jewelry for nobles and those of upper middle class status. More interesting than this, though, is the set of alchemical properties afforded by these gems. There are 3 positive effects. When combined with bittergreen petals, they can produce a potion of complete invisibility. This could create a positive feedback loop for thieving alchemists. If they should steal 1 gem, they can make a potion, steal even more, and so on. There's also the ability to create a reflecting potion by way of combining ground diamonds with fresh comberry leaves. Incoming spells from would-be assailants can be reflected back at them, taking them by surprise. Finally, when combined with ashiums, muck, or a spore pod, all things you can find in the southern half of the island, the diamond can produce a magical enchantment that allows one to detect the location of keys. Pairing this with the invisibility potion would be incredibly efficient, allowing a thief to loot almost anything at will. It makes sense then that these gems are so expensive and well guarded, even if that doesn't ward off the ne'er-do-wells. The discovery of this diamond deposit near Caldera should have a greater impact on their society. Perhaps the largest industrial mine on the island is the Caldera Ebony mine not far from town. One would think that many miners would be sent here upon the discovery, seeing as how diamonds have a far more efficient gold-to-weight ratio. From the mine in its current state alone, they would be able to generate 15,250 gold. This is why I believe the discovery to be new. Either that or the Imperials on duty are trying to claim the bounty for themselves. This would explain why no one has ever been sent with news to the other company bases, and why so few miners are in the cavern. Maybe those Dunmer are being held there with threats, or they have been promised a cut of the loot that will soon be acquired. And who's to say they won't mark up the prices? There exist 12 strange towers across the land of Vardenfell, many of them extending downward into the earth. They have a very unassuming appearance and have a history shrouded in mystery. In modern times, they are often inhabited by members of House Delvani, looking to master sorcery away from all forms of distraction. On an island southeast of Molag Mar, one sees the Dome of Mawia. It's surrounded by tapering boulders and is easily reached by way of a series of elevated stones. On the exterior, it looks quaint, almost idyllic. However, one step inside will ensure the adventurer that something is terribly wrong. A morbid warning is displayed, with many skulls latched onto a wooden fence. A large central chamber sits barren, other than a lonely campfire and a corpse of an ill-fated traveler. Skulls and bones litter the ground absent-mindedly, as if tossed behind a wizard while they stepped away. Another hint at what occurs here can be found in those standing along the halls. The undead, reanimated skeletons and bone lords, are standing, or floating, guard. Making one's way into the dome of the Velothi Tower will reveal at last what is occurring here. A sick necromancer has been practicing his vile craft, raising bodies such as this poor corpse on the pedestal. The sounds of Daedric voices travel through the ritual station, ready to imbue this skeleton with unlife. A bed sits in the corner, though how this man can sleep at night is a magical wonder of its own. Upon tables rest books of notes, theories on the dark arts, and even small skulls, suggesting that no life is beyond this wicked Dunmer's grasp. A table of cannibalistic material sits in the corner, equipped with alchemical gear from which to create some sort of evil concoction. More texts line the shelves, as well as ingredients pulled from the unlucky. A skeleton lies in frozen fear across the top of the bookcase, perhaps the next guardian of the halls. The Bone Lords and skeletons roaming the halls help to make this place incredibly creepy. They're undoubtedly more of Delvim's evil creations. It seems he was starting an army of some sort, as there do not seem to be any chores that he was using them for. This would be typical of Morrowind's understated events, many of which could severely alter the timeline should they have occurred unimpeded. Delvim's room at the top of the tower is super spooky, and the red candles do a lot to create that atmosphere. The bones, skulls, and skeletons in this room are all used in different ways, suggesting that he did indeed take some of them seriously. However, at the same time, he used skulls as paperweights. He was a sick and complex character from context clues alone, as he had no real dialogue to discuss the situation, instead attacking on sight. It's a shame. This almost felt as though it could have been its own plugin rather than simply being related to a quest of the Tribunal Temple. Now we should discuss the loot. This tower, I would say, is one of the more extravagant examples of the dungeon type, but a good one all the same. To begin, we have all the ingredients born from the undead that we've discussed in the earlier segments of the video. We also have a treasury room which houses 2 level chests with superb gear dependent upon the player's level. In the first chest was a dreg staff worth 400 gold alone. Then there was a cheap enchanted cuirass, a handful of gems, and a stack of 356 gold. The other had a dwarven mace worth 360 gold, another cheap magic cuirass, more gems, and another wad of gold. These 2 chests alone are worth the journey into the dungeon, and on higher levels, both of them will even spawn Daedric weapons. Upon the body of Delvim is Shimsil, a unique short blade. It does decent damage and has some minor sneaky enchantments on it. What's more important though is that this weapon alone is worth 10,000 gold. That is so much gold that only one inhabitant of the island of Vardenfell has enough to purchase it at full cost. And they aren't even human. If you know, you know. While not typical of these dungeons, it happened to exist in this one, so I wanted to show it. There are many books in the top room, including on the sacrificial skeleton, that are worth hundreds. These should be taken and sold. While doing so, you'll glimpse some knowledge within and gain skill bonuses to boot. There's also a scroll of elemental burst that can do incredible damage in a pinch. The Velothi Towers are quite unique, each often housing a researcher with a different realm of study, including but not limited to necromancy. The loot in these towers is usually pretty good, and some are even hosted by friendly characters. Whenever you visit one of these dungeons, you never quite know what to expect. Though Vardenfell serves as a distinct landmass of Morrowind, its capital is actually on the mainland, in the region of Deshaun. Beneath the capital city of Mournhold are a vast maze of sewers. A lot of these seem to be used for maintenance purposes of some kind. There are also a lot of pipes and sections in the sewer, especially considering there are no visible toilets in Mournhold. I would consider pipes for bathing water being housed in the ceiling, however, the people of Morrowind tend to use a bucket system for that sort of thing. Looking at the overland water systems, we can see fountains of water in the Plaza Brindisi Dorum, surrounding a statue of Almalexia battling Mayrun Stegan. There are also manholes and open canals along the streets in Godsreach, as well as the other city sections. There are grates through which the water can travel, meaning these pipes and such are primarily used for irrigation, calling to question the method that the city uses for biological waste removal. Maybe they just use fire magic or Dwemer contraptions to teleport it to another dimension. There are many segments of the sewers that are completely flooded, with water pouring in from the city above. It's a bit reassuring that these seem not to do with waste, as an adventurer has to swim through the water just to travel to its different segments. As mentioned, these sewers are labyrinthian. They're incredibly large and mostly empty, save for some crates here and there. These usually contain nothing, and if they do, it's some low-level randomized selection of items. The enemies in this location are very difficult at times, and often swarm in huge number. The sewers are infested with all sorts of ruffians, goblins, and even their pet durzogs, dog-like creatures with faces only a mother could love. Traveling in groups, they can be difficult for even the most seasoned warrior. These sewers are primarily a desert, and though there is water, I hardly recall an oasis. The many creatures swarming you are ridiculously strong and can heal themselves with potions. It's amazing goblins can think to do this, but no sentient people can. Of course, this is probably a coding thing. The goblins use it once, whereas a mage might heal themselves over and over, making a battle last indefinitely. Concerning their strength though, these goblins put out a lot of damage with their strange swords and axes. They seem to be made of some sort of bone, but I'm not sure there are any real explanations behind them. These weapons do pack a punch regardless of the wielder, and they strangely have enchantment capabilities on par with ebony armaments. Their conditions are quite fragile, and so one must always keep repair hammers or tongs on hand if they want to use them. The shields are worth a decent 1,000 gold each, and so they are the primary loot one should take from the bodies. Also, weird note, but I'm almost certain goblins in Mournhold have the same sound effect as they do in Arena. The Durzogs are very interesting and creepy beasts. They have many red eyes and, although standing in the gait of a dog, can reach their claws toward a victim as though they were arms. They have large tusks, but strangely seem not to use them in battle. Perhaps this one died a little too soon to tell. The dots on their head seem to be 2 pairs of nostrils, perhaps indicating that this large creature has a very costly energy system requiring lots of oxygen movement. When it comes to loot, the meat cut from a Durzog can be used to produce potions of agility and strength fortification, both good options. Fortifying strength is especially good for carrying large amounts of loot or simply powering up your melee attacks. And that's all there really is for creatures, avoiding story spoilers. From a design standpoint, these sewers don't seem to hit the mark. There's very little reward for exploring them, and they're quite empty. Although the aesthetic is unique at first, the quests of the Tribunal DLC will have you trekking the canals for hours. By the 3rd quest in the sewers, the location becomes monotonous. In my opinion, the only cool thing about the sewers is that they add some depth to the capital city, however hollow, and that they lead to some incredibly cool story locations in Old Mournhold, which the new city was built upon. The island of Solstheim has always been a contested space between the Dunmer and the Nords, the latter of which have buried some of their dead there. There are 16 barrows containing past loved ones, as well as chests of loot for them to take into the Nordic afterlife of Sovngarde. Much like the tombs of the Dunmer, there are reanimated dead patrolling inside. A major difference between these undead, called the Draugr, and the ancestral spirits and skeletons of the Dunmeri tombs, is the method by which they came to their current state. According to Korst Windeye, the shaman of the Skull Village, the Draugr were once Nords that became stranded on the island. Struggling with conditions and the lack of food, many began to perish. Those that remained fed on their fallen brethren, cannibalizing them to stay alive. The Allmaker, also known as Shor, cursed them for having done so. They were given the punishment of eternal life, and their minds rotted away. They lost every sense except hunger, which drives them in their perpetual suffering. If one can survive battling the Draugr and other creatures that may roam the halls, they might find the remaining spoils of fallen warriors which were laid to rest there. They may also find Stalrim, an incredibly rare crafting material used to make Nordic armor and weaponry. This magic ice is worth 60 gold per pound, and can be combined with grave tar from the Draugr to make potions of frost resistance. The chests in these locations are typically loaded with weapons meant for travel to Sovngarde. Since a grave robber has no morals, they can claim these objects for themselves, earning a pretty penny along the way. As seen in Eddard Barrow, the interiors of these tombs are dark and depressing, desolate and devoid. It calls to mind the horrors which befell the Draugr and led them to their current fate. In terms of layout, the barrows stand mostly above ground in a mausoleum-type design, which is opposite of the Dunmer, thus drawing one more contrast between the two races. They're carved of stone and stand quite tall, proving visible landmarks across the island, whereas Ancestral Tombs could be missed if one is not looking carefully. Though perhaps that is the point. Nords are not a bashful people and tend to look death in the face. The Draugr are an ironic example of this. They used to terrify me, and still carry some ineffable sense of unease with their ability to remain so agile and vicious over untold decades of a torturous existence. Much like Vardenfell, the smaller island of Solstheim has its fair share of caves. These caves are all full of snow and ice, making for an interesting aesthetic, and separating them from those caves we have already covered. Their exteriors are very reminiscent of Elder Scrolls 1 and 2 in terms of design, being burrowed into a mound. These caves serve as home for a variety of enemies, including the sentient Reeklings, small blue creatures of unassuming power. They often ride bristleback boars, adding to their ferocity. Within others are creatures known as Grawl, very worrisome beasts that resemble an upright hog with giant clawed hands. They are eerily quiet and almost seem otherworldly. There are 20 ice caves on the island, some playing host to Nords, while most are home only to creatures. Inside them are enemies to battle and the occasional chest. Most of these caves offer more story-driven content rather than loot. In the case of Fryked, there is a corpse pinned to the ceiling. Its name was Angria, and they were the leader of a group of bandits that pillaged the Snow Prince's tomb. The Snow Prince being a snow elf or Falmer. When felled in battle, the Nords honored him by creating a barrow of his own. These thieves were chased down and killed due to their actions. How Angria was pinned to the ceiling, we will never know. There are other caves such as Ben Congerike, which have very little loot but contain minor story elements, such as Frissa's ill fate. This woman from the Mages Guild traveled here when she was expelled for unknown reasons. She managed to create a magical robe and planned to show it off. However, she accidentally placed some negative enchantments on it that resulted in her untimely death. The rest of the cave is largely ignorable, as the loot at the end is meager. Finally, we can look at the ice cave of Fiel. Here, a bunch of loot was stowed away in a secret room. Then, somehow, the thief managed to get Giant Grawl to guard it. Unfortunately, his control over them was no match for their raw power. He died trying to escape them after he planted his stash. If the adventurer manages to best all of the Grawl within the cave and reach the final room, they'll find a simple chest. Behind it, in the ice, is an arrow made of diamonds pointing straight down into a block of ice or snow. This is hollowed out, and inside are many gems. These all combine to be worth about 6,500 gold, which is a great amount for one dungeon. As far as unconventional loot goes, the caves often house beasts we mentioned before: Reeklings, boars, wolves, and Grawl. The latter three all drop some form of ingredient. The boars can be skinned for leather, the wolves for their pelts, and the Grawls can have their eyeballs plucked out. If one combines the Grawl eyeball with the wolf pelt, it will create a potion of Night Eye, allowing for easier visibility in caves and nighttime travel. Pretty much any mix of the other ingredients on the island will result in a frost resistance or frost shield potion. Although these caves are pretty simple, they often include challenging enemies that are fun to fight. The loot is usually small in number, with the story elements or Easter eggs being the primary reward. If I had to guess why this is the case, I would assume it's because this DLC is recommended as the final leg of your Morrowind journey. The heightened damage outputs and health pools of enemies on the island are a clear indication that a low-level player is out of place. Still, the Barrows have more than enough loot to make up for these caves. The other, larger locations used in story segments also offer a lot, and so these caves having smaller elements to them is not a big issue by any means. As mentioned earlier, the Elder Scrolls III Morrowind was created by a team of around 40 people, and a percentage of that worked on creating the dungeons. They did so within the Elder Scrolls Construction Set, a tool that was made freely available to all fans of the series. In it, one can create new locations, import their own textures and models, add scripting, change enemy spawns and sizes, etc. This is an incredible tool and one that is relatively easy to pick up. For example, I made a mod for Anasi's house in Pelagiad, adding a small trophy room to the building. When you have the hang of it, the system is easy to use. However, the dungeons also require the designer to adhere to specific themes in keeping with lore, plausibility, and fun in mind. The fact that this relatively small team was able to create 360 plus unique dungeons, in most cases, blows my mind. Yes, it took 6 years, but when looking at the depth this title offers in the base game alone, compared to modern experiences, this is quite the feat. As for smaller size and similar limitations of the dungeons, this was probably due to a few factors including the amount of people working on them, the in-game character speed limiting their breadth, and the toll on the system that would be taken should they be massive sprawling dungeons like later in the series. No matter what, the dungeons of Vardenfell have and forever will hold a place in my heart. As a child I feared them, never entering the tombs or caves unless I had to for a quest. As an adult I look fondly upon that time, realizing that, even skipping the bulk of what the game had to offer, Morrowind gave me so much content that I barely noticed I was missing anything. The hand-placed items, mysterious set dressing, creepy sounds, and lore-heavy locations all sell it for me. In the heart of Tamriel sits the Imperial City, the crown jewel of the Empire. From here, the orders are issued that place forts in other provinces, further expanding their control. Wars rage beyond the mountains in strange lands, unfamiliar to many of the city's inhabitants. But walking through the verdant wilds of Cyrodiil wouldn't bring that to mind. Instead, you'd see peaceful waters, grazing deer, and thick forests of trees. There are beautiful plants, mushrooms, and more that call these forests home. It is this strange balance of knowledge and first-hand experience that leads an adventurer to view Cyrodiil with an odd sense of bittersweetness. The Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion takes place primarily in this province only 6 years after the events of Morrowind, and provides the player with many dungeons to crawl. These include Ayleid Ruins, caves, forts, mines, and more. Beyond the base game locations, there are 2 distinct types of dungeons in the Shivering Isles expansion. By the definition of this video, there are 265 dungeons in the game, divided between 7 total types. Similar to Morrowind's dungeons, these were created in an iteration of the Elder Scrolls Construction Set. The team that worked on the game consisted of about 70 people, nearly double that of the previous title. After the primary dungeon discussion, we will talk about some of the key people that made these locations a reality. Some important details to remember as we journey through Cyrodiil are the following. It should be noted up front that the enemies and loot are basically always randomly selected, based upon the player's level. Each dungeon typically has a boss enemy that is stronger than the rest, a trend that will continue in Skyrim. There are also tons of traps, including spikes, pitfalls, tripwires, and so on. All loot in these dungeons will respawn after 3 days or so, as well as the inhabitants. That way, certain dungeons can be replayed once you've finished others. This game was also the first to introduce dungeon-specific musical pieces, something Morrowind did not have. A few of these will no doubt be heard within the video. Finally, the following dungeons were explored with a level 25 character. This was done in order to provide the most generic dungeon experience possible. Now, with all this information covered, let us talk about them in detail. Long before the Third Era and the events of the Elder Scrolls IV, there was the very first empire of Tamriel. These were the Ayleids, a race of elves that previously existed on Somerset Isle. In the Merethic era, they set out to explore lands deeper into the heart of Tamriel and came to settle in what is now called Cyrodiil. As the distance from the Isle was quite far, some of the rules began to be bent. Many of these Heartland Aldmer began to worship the Daedra, now free from the burdens of moral quandary. Over time, Daedra worship took a complete hold over these Aldmer, who now referred to themselves as the Ayleids, or the Heartland High Elves. They dove into magical pursuits with a fervor unbound by rules and regulation. They even created the magical school of alteration. This led to some dire events. There was infighting amongst those who followed the demonic Daedra and the more benevolent Aedra, known today as the Divines. There's a stark difference between the Aedra Mara, the goddess of love and compassion, and, say, Molech Bal, the Daedric prince of domination and enslavement. As such, the two sides of the coin would battle until Aedra worshippers were ultimately overrun and cast out, if they got off lightly. Even before the split between the Aedra and Daedra worshippers and the total consolidation of belief systems in the region, there was the political distress. Each city-state was controlled by a sorcerer king. They often had differing ideas of which patron deity should be the one focus, and so fighting continued between them at nearly all times. In the background of this never-ending conflict, there was the issue of slavery. The Needs, a race of humans across Tamriel in the Merethic era, had been captured and enslaved by the Ayleids. Their suffering continued for hundreds of years, and they were forced not only to work and build many of the Ayleid structures, but also underwent vicious torture for various purposes. There were often competitions between various city-states to see which group could invent the most twisted form of torture. It was a game to them, and one which their Daedric lords enjoyed. The Temple of the Ancestors, now known as the White Gold Tower, was built, a massive achievement and a symbol of the Ayleid Empire. This was made to emulate the Durrani Tower of High Rock, the first known structure in all of Tamriel. Eventually, a woman named Alessia led a slave rebellion to fight back against the Ayleids. Those Ayleids that worshipped the Aedra often sided with the rebellion and fought alongside them, aiding in their battle for freedom, though they once took advantage themselves. The history of the Ayleids is incredibly interesting and something I would like to discuss further in the future. For now though, we know that the Alessian Rebellion led to their complete defeat in the First Era, as well as the start of the empire we know today. These ruins are what is left of the once powerful society. Much like the Ayleids themselves, their structures were beautiful, but brutal, and now they exist in ruins such as their society. The stones shine a bright white color, heavily contrasting the forest they're so often surrounded by. Moss climbs up the walls, turning them green or yellow in some spots. Many arches reach skyward, much as the Ayleids did for their materials. Along the base of the white stones are many plants, including foxglove and dragon's tongue. Were it not for the atrocities necessary for these ruins to exist, their beauty would be unparalleled. Here we see a ritualistic table upon which are red tapestries of necromantic origin. This hints easily at what lies inside, and is also one of the only locations upon which one could acquire a black soul gem, those used to capture the souls of humans and myrrh. The interiors of the ruins are a dim greenish blue, and are nearly silent, unlike those of the Dwemer who came before them. The bare walls are minimalistic. The halls are windowed by metal engravings and open views which peer down into rooms of ceremonial aesthetic. Light comes from teal stones and metal braziers, and pillars stand tall to keep the stability of the structure intact. Over many years, pieces of stone have fallen, leading to piles of debris throughout the dungeon. Within some of the walls of the Ayleid ruins are what seem to be bare stretches of earth, inside which have been placed these small teal crystals. Much like in the braziers, these were the only sources of light deemed adequate and pure by the Ayleids. To them, fire was primitive and even impure. These blue stones are seen all throughout Ayleid Ruins and Cyrodiil, and have a very interesting history in themselves. The material they are made from is known as meteoric glass. This is a type of ethereal fragment, meaning it quite literally falls from the heavens. The Ayleids, also being obsessed with stars and constellations, took these fragments as further signs of their superiority. Regardless of the hubris, one must agree they are mystifying. But not only does this blue ethereal glass adorn their structures as an aesthetic choice, it also possesses great magic power. It can only be harnessed by the best of sorcerers, and has been used to create a variety of things, including enchanted objects. The most prevalent of these objects today are the result of further refining these natural wonders. These are known as the Welkind and Varla stones. Welkend, translating to the aptly named Sky Children, stones can be used to refill one's magical abilities. These stones can be found on high pedestals throughout Ayleid Ruins, which most likely allow the power of protective spells and such to amplify their power throughout the structures. As the different Ayleid city-states were consistently in war with one another, and eventually even their slaves, one can imagine the frantic need to spell trap any and all entrances. Otherwise, they were probably used to hold excess magicka stores in case a difficult ritual or process was running low on energy. The Varla stones are much rarer and are encased in the same metal used elsewhere in Ayleid construction, which is meteoric iron. This too fell from the heavens alongside the glass and was used to create magical structures due to its physical and ethereal strength. Notably, this ethereal iron is not only used in metal engravings and Varla stones, but also in Ayleid wells, of which there are 55 in Cyrodiil. These locations are found throughout the province and provide a recharge to one's magical supply, much like the Welkend stones. The Varla stones, named for the Ayleidun word for star, are used to recharge enchanted gear. As they are rare, they are often locked up tight within the ruins, sometimes unearthed by modern inhabitants. As mentioned, the Ayleids were constantly warring with one party or another. It makes sense then that, on top of their magically derived traps, they would also have mechanical hazards placed about the ruins. These include poison gas, enclosed poison rooms, guillotines, dark Welkend stones, and more. I imagine these would be taught and memorized by every member of each city-state, that way they would not be killed while going about their daily affairs. Between each segment of these ruins is a shining door with a beautiful engraving of meteoric glass. It almost looks like a tree. The deeper into the structure one goes, the more traps are typically encountered. It makes sense that the Ayleids would hide their most valuable possessions and personnel within the most defensible locations. There are large open rooms with retractable stairs, an incredible setting for an ambush of intruders. All of these structural features and more can be found throughout the Ayleid Ruins of Cyrodiil. Looking at this particular ruin, known as Wendelbeck, or, roughly, Journey of Elbeck, we can see it now houses a despicable cast of necromancers. Cloaked in black uniform robes, each of them sinks into the shadows of this once great structure. They have brought their own light sources with them, lighting fires to work by. The Ayleids would be rolling in their graves, which, I suppose, the necromancers would be fine with. Disgusting rituals are conducted, with corpses filling rooms in various states of decay. Blood and bones are littered about, with a complete lack of dignity or respect. One can only imagine the poor soul who was killed and dragged down for such a vile purpose. In a nearby jail cell are 3 walking dead, one of which being a strong variety imbued with vicious magical power. The poor souls walk on rotting feet, inhale through mouths they cannot close, or find their way by blind stumbling only, as they're missing a head altogether. These necromancers have set up a strong position in the interior of an ambush hall, making use of Varla and Welkend stones to fuel their disgusting habits. Through the use of specific stone blocks marked by ethereal glass, one can unlock different segments of the structure. Following this new path, we come across a necromancer that has failed their project so many times that their victims have simply been tossed in the trash together. Although an inexcusable act by all means, at least this one didn't leave them strewn about the ground. And, since they failed, the souls can continue to rest. It does bring an important thing to mind though. It is very unlikely that these are Ayleids, as we are not seeing any caskets or other burial phenomena, though we also do not know what the burial practices of the Ayleids were. Those that remained in Cyrodiil and worshipped the Daedra were not averse to necromancy, so they themselves perhaps raised their fallen competitors and used these armies across the lands, losing one another to time. It's a grim and ironic fate. In some Ayleid ruins are small statues. These are very rare, with only 10 known to exist. Known as the Ancestors, these statues are made of a single shard of meteoric glass, surrounded by ethereal iron. The massive ruins of Wendelbeck seem to lead to a dead-end hallway. However, if one steps on a pressure plate, the forward door will fall down in front of them, revealing a secret escape back toward the entrance. The Ayleids had many plans, and I imagine the use of slaves in constructing these devices did not aid them in the eventual rebellion. The Ayleid Ruins are perhaps my favorite dungeon type to delve within the game. There are 52 of them, and they are so large and beautifully structured, punctuated with traps that you can avoid if aware, and usually have quite a valuable set of loot. On the necromancers are often sets of healing and magic potions, as well as scrolls that can sometimes be worth a few hundred gold pieces. Used in their schemes are soul gems naturally, and so some can also generally be found around them. There are many Ayleid casks and coffers around, some of them locked. Inside are randomized pieces of loot including jewelry, gold, and so on. Up high on pedestals are the aforementioned Welkend and Varla stones, which are quite useful and simply fun to collect. The best way to do this is to use an arrow and knock them down, preferably from the side so they don't get stuck like this. Otherwise, a character with low acrobatics will not be able to reach them. Many chests are also complete bunk, such as this one that had a bit of gold and a single poison that you could apply to a weapon. Especially as leveled gear, this is a bit underwhelming. You typically have enchanted armaments at this point. If not, poisoning a weapon can bypass the normal weapon resistance of some ghostly enemies, even if they resist the poison itself. As a level 25 character though, there isn't much use for it. The smaller coffers also usually contain jewelry, a small sum of gold, and maybe a soul gem or two. Magical tomes can also be found within all dungeons if the player has the DLC add-on. The traps are often easy to get around, but when you miss them, they can be somewhat annoying. I failed to remember the last time I died to them though. The necromancers can summon undead, understandably, but that ability has no teeth. See, since that one doesn't even have a head, if they're on an island and you can attack with range. Sometimes NPC enemies will also have randomly generated magical gear, which sells for a pretty septum. In the early game, these are often useful enough to keep. These necromancers are also holding glass maces, a very strong weapon type. This is a good time to recall what we talked about briefly at the start of the Oblivion segment. NPC enemies are randomly generated based on the player's level. This means their stats, health, damage, etc. scale to your level, as well as their gear. Hence, a high-level player will often see NPCs with glass, Dwemer, or even Daedric armaments. It definitely makes the pieces seem less interesting or important, and also causes a bit of disconnect. In Morrowind, if you saw someone with Daedric gear, you knew they were a big deal. Now you can just wait till you reach a high level and go hit up a bandit camp, then leave with a full set. This is a common complaint people have with the game. At this point you're typically rolling in coins, so the extra loot value sort of loses meaning as well. This issue persists across all dungeons that include NPC characters, so if I do not mention it again, it is only because we've already discussed it here. Now back to this dungeon. I really do enjoy when the layout is not fully straightforward. The fact that you need to search the ruins gives an excuse to see more cool structural design and to fight more enemies. Pressing buttons and working your way through the ruins is pretty rewarding, I'd say. There's always this sense of each button press leading you to the eventual dungeon boss. Here we can see another instance of randomly generated magical loot, as well as one of the tomes I mentioned from before. These will teach you a spell and can be kept and sold afterward. However, a word of warning. In Oblivion you cannot delete spells once you know them, so you should only accept the spell if you know you certainly want it. Otherwise, it'll end up clogging your magical inventory. When looking at loot in terms of ingredients, you'll often only come across undead in these ruins. In this particular case, we found mortal flesh from the zombies, which can be used to create potions of health fortification, as well as poisons of silence to combat magic-wielding foes. Too bad this didn't protect the bodies as they lay before the necromancers reached them. In specific ruins, you can also find Aurorans, Daedric minions of Meridia. They drop Daedra hearts, which can create potions of health and shock shielding, or poisons to use against mages in battle. The plants found outside can be used for potions of health restoration, fire shield, fire resistance, resistance to poison, paralysis, disease, etc. These are some fantastic effects. As a master alchemist in this game can create potions from a single ingredient, these can really help an adventurer survive many of the traps and magical effects found below. Keep in mind that the flora around each Ayleid dungeon may not be the same. After routing through the entire dungeon, you come across an easy exit. This would become a trend for these dungeons and future ones. In this case, I'm not bothered by it. It totally fits the lore of the Ayleids with all of their contraptions built before the rebellion. It also helps in this case because the ruins are freaking huge. Compared to most locations in Morrowind, these dungeons are gargantuan, and they don't even represent the entire Ayleid city they are a part of, only the segments that are just below the surface. Beyond that, the single-layer maps in Oblivion can be somewhat difficult to understand perspective-wise, so this aids in escaping if you get lost. I have to say, some of these rooms are simply gorgeous. It's such a shame what begot them, and that the talents weren't used to the glory of the builders themselves. The combination of ethereal metals and crystals is absolutely wild. Combining the glowing teal glass with the white stone is a recipe for an unforgettable aesthetic, and a certain example of deference for the unreachable planes above. There are 94 caves across the surface of Cyrodiil, each of them boring into mounds of rock or hillside. Wooden doors cover the entrance, blocking light from reaching the interior. Inside are a vast array of caverns, passageways carved through rock and time. There are both stalagmites and stalactites, sometimes meeting in the middle, holding on before time bids them to part. Around the floor are often different types of fungi, including whisk stalks and caramboletes, which enjoy the damp atmosphere. Broad rooms of strangely rigid shape play host to a variety of creatures. Here we see ogres patrolling, their gargantuan mass dwarfed by the size of the cavern. Throughout the caves are skylights, allowing daylight from above to filter in, which casts a teal glow about the rocks. Spriggans, deceptive mimics of native trees, will also enter the caves from time to time. This may be to commune with the roots, which sometimes hang from the ceiling, or to plan their next ambush on a passing traveler. Land dregs, counterpart to their aquatic relatives, can also be found skulking about the open caverns. They have crimson carapaces and put other crustaceans to shame. Their razor-sharp teeth and shoulder scythes are certain to scare off any would-be spelunkers. Of course, there are the smaller crustaceans as well. Small crabs, taking a break from the nearby stream, seek refuge in locations that are as damp as they can get. They may also be hunting small insects and arachnids that crawl throughout the cave, seeing as this one is actively feeding. Human debris often litters the caves of Cyrodiil, much of it standing upright. This could mean people previously inhabited the caves, or that some event washed them down from holes in the earth above. Occasionally, one may come across a room that is so perfectly arranged as to be an art piece, not something crafted by erosion processes. Mushrooms abound, and heavy mist settles as one finds themselves deeper underground. Here we can even see a stashed chest with mushrooms growing from its wood. A fun fact is that this would suggest there is a mycelial web just within the surface of the lid, probably coursing through its entire interior. The nutrients from the old wood, mixed with the damp conditions of the cavern, give the cairn bolete its proper home. I love the small detail. As if the inhabitants weren't strange enough, a will-o-wisp can be seen gliding through the tunnels, its golden glow haunting, taking complete attention away from the adjacent ogre. Its light can be blinding when contrasted with the natural darkness of the dungeon. This particular cave, known as Crayfish Cave, rests right along the Corbola River, which carries water and nutrients downstream from Lake Popad. There are docks just outside and still flaming fires within. This all suggests that, along with the creatures that call this place home, some person or group of people thought this would be a great place to hunt, fish, and live. The presence of minotaurs would counter that idea. They're both inside and outside the cave, patrolling with great big eyes that survey all around them. Just beyond this massive behemoth of a minotaur is a lit cave, with an unfortunate human skeleton sitting beside a chest. The cost of adventure can be higher than its reward at times. Deeper within Crayfish Cave, the caverns begin to waterlog. This could be the result of rainwater percolating through the ground above, as well as water from the river seeping between the rocks. Perhaps over grand spans of time, these two scenarios combined and form the cave, and these waters stand mostly stagnant at the bottom. Eventually, through a locked wooden door, we find a room in which a solitary goblin threw himself a wild birthday party. Quite literally below the keg, this poor individual ostensibly got alcohol poisoning from downing the contents of this barrel, not to mention the 20 bottles of beer on the carved shelf. At least he was organized. It's a shame he died. Perhaps he could have been fun to chat with. More examples of plight abound, with a person having died from breaking their back during a long fall. Then, a newly dead adventurer sits near a smoldering campfire. There's no note, nor any further explanation of the tragedy. By the stage of decomposition, I would assume all the other human remains were from long ago. This was but one more adventurer who bit off more than he could chew. When discussing the gameplay aspects of this dungeon, I need to start by saying it is absolutely massive. Now, this is one example of the largest possible dungeons, but even 2-zone dungeons can feel like a gargantuan commitment. The beasts found in the cave are leveled, of course, as is the loot. Although there are many chests spread throughout the place, their contents are not amazing. They typically have a handful of gold and maybe a potion or gem. Each chest gives somewhere from 50 to 100 gold on average between all its contents. However, there are times when the random loot is in your favor, giving you a randomly generated magical item with constant effect enchantments. These are often good for early game, but are even better for making money. Finding 1 or 2 pieces of this gear can make an entire dungeon worth it. As a shining example of beneficial RNG, we can look at this battle axe of putrefaction. It's worth 4,500 gold alone. In the worst case scenario, a chest in the dungeon can be a complete waste of time. For example, this is the last chest of the cave that isn't a boss chest. It had tons of lockpicks around it to imply that the previous traveler failed over and over to get into it. After breaking through the average lock, I received less than 50 gold. And this is in the last zone of the dungeon too. Not a great reward here. Still, I left this cave with enough loot to make at least 10,000 gold at my current level, so I can let it slide. Before we leave the chest discussion, I need to voice one of my primary concerns about the caves here. The chests all seem to be strung about in this cave. The presence of human remains would suggest that a squad of adventurers or bandits simply dropped them as they ran through the caverns. Although this is goofy, I can make the stretch. However, even in caves fully inhabited by monsters and with no human or elven presence to speak of, there will be pristine wooden chests at various points. This does sort of kill the realism for me when I'm running through them. The looting is fun, but cave dungeons feel more like a spelunking theme park where the creatures are animatronic and the chests were refilled just before I got there. My final real concern attaches to the last. The caves are quite large, and I really enjoy the addition of rock formations, mushrooms, skylights, and so on, but once you have completed a cave or two, all the rest look extremely similar. In Morrowind, caves were made from single texture pieces that resembled dirt and made large circular caverns that you would wind through. In this game, everything is more detailed, and there are unique structural pieces that were formed together to create the cave. Because these are all very deliberately defined, they tend to stand out when repeated. The largest example of this is the rock ledge that appears in nearly every room, almost always below a skylight. It can lead one to get lost, thinking they had been in that room before. Within Crayfish Cave alone, this piece is repeated many times. Technically, there are 4 variations of this specific cave piece, but all of them look incredibly similar. If you combine the number of times these variants are used in the game overall, you end up with 998 examples. There are 94 caves in Cyrodiil. Even though these caves vary in size, let's just average them as one consistent dungeon type. In this exercise, we would find that every cave system includes at least 10 of the same cave piece with the same light filtering to it, and oftentimes holding a chest that the light points to, and the skylights come from holes that do not appear in the overland, although I can understand that limitation. Morrowind can get away with this sort of asset recycling, as the textures are all very similar in the game's art style. However, these more intricate pieces suffer from their heightened graphical definition. Along with the chest placement, it just removes any sense of being in an actual wild cave. Oh, and the fact that there are a bunch of secret rock contraptions that allow quick escape from dungeons. These make far less sense than those in the Ayleid Ruins. Moving on from the chest loot, we also have the ingredients from the enemies. Ogre's Teeth can be used to make potions of strength fortification, paralysis resistance, and also poisons that do shock damage to the enemy. Rat and crab meat both combine to make damage fatigue poisons. Separately, they can make life detection or potions of shock and fire resistance. The shock resistance effect is maintained from the mud crabs in Morrowind. Maybe they have a natural immunity to the conduction effects of electricity and water. Land dregs drop wax that can be used to make water-breathing potions, most notably. Taproots from Spriggans can be used to resist poison, restore luck, and gain a shield against shock damage. Minotaur horns can be ground into an aphrodisiac to fortify endurance, allow one to restore their willpower, and resist paralysis. Insert your favorite innuendo here. As mentioned before, there are a few types of mushrooms that typically grow in these caves. One is the whisk stalk, which is mostly used in poisons that damage health, but can also fortify your speed if mixed carefully. The cairnbalit can restore your health, opposite to its roommates. It can also make poisons of shock damage. Mixing this with Ogre's Teeth is a quick and easy way to strengthen your odds in the dungeon. Another mushroom commonly found in caves, but not found in the Crayfish Cave, are the stinkhorns. They can be used to make poisons of health damage when mixed with the whisk stalks. They can also be used to restore magicka, make one invisible, or even allow them to walk on water. It's a very versatile fungal body. As far as realism, I believe we've already discussed the bulk of it. The formation of the caves are suspect, especially in locations where they are in higher elevation with no nearby water bodies, but maintain a similar size to the other caves. Maybe those ones were made by tectonic shifting or something. Your guess is as good as mine. The growing of mushrooms in caves is actually a real thing. In fact, there are many cases in history of humans intentionally farming them this way. The damp and dark locations are perfect for them, as they lack the ability to do photosynthesis and thus need no light. Instead, these particular cave shrooms would be saprotrophic, externally digesting materials in order to gain energy. This is why the mushrooms growing on dampened chests was a really cool addition. As for the lower segments of the dungeon, were the standing waters real, they'd be brimming with bacteria. The lack of many animals to kick around the waters would allow bat guano and such, which could also be used as food for fungi in drier areas, to simply sit and release its contents. The presence of monsters here does affect the theory somewhat, but not entirely. Even caves in which scientists regularly perform research will have stagnant water bodies with surface scum layers. Do I expect the game developers to get that intricate with water systems and maybe add poison damage in those caves? No, not really. The former would be incredibly difficult. I just think it would be a cool idea that would further add realism. Although, as we have now come to understand, that did not seem to be the goal for the cave dungeon type. After the Alessian slave rebellion, Saint Alessia herself became queen, leading the first recognized empire of humanity in Tamriel. The Needs, which are the ancestors of both the Imperials and Bretons, now had control over wide expanses of Tamriel, but, most relevantly, they controlled the land now known as Cyrodiil. This empire lasted for over 2,000 years and comprised the entirety of the First Era. Toward the end of that era, Riemann Cyrodiil, for which the land would later be named, led teams to defeat an Akaviri invasion of Tamriel. During this time, many forts were constructed across the region, including those surrounding the vital imperial city. After Riemann's success in repelling the invasion, the Second Empire was born, and he was crowned emperor. Despite the victory, more troubles would soon come to this society. The forts were used to repel invaders, secure borders, and of course, protect the capital city. This empire lasted around 650 years, and all the while there were many periods of political unrest. Around the 220-year mark, the Saci had taken the crown, beginning in the Second Era. They persist for extreme durations, their lives apparently prolonged by magic, hence there were but 2 Saci emperors within the final 430 years of the Second Empire. During the transition from the Second to Third Era, there was a period of great strife known as the Interregnum. Although the Second Empire had claimed all the land save for Morrowind during its peak of power, it eventually held nothing but Cyrodiil, prompting the last defenders to man the forts once more. Even at this point, the forts were falling into disrepair along with pretty much everything else in the dwindling empire. Cities and their connecting roads were neglected, and resources were thin. One of the largest issues that these forts persisted through was the Three Banners War, in which 3 different alliances vied for control of Cyrodiil and, assuming that victory, would have moved on to conquer all of Tamriel. This was one of the harshest stretches of the interregnum, and one that was ultimately put to rest by the enforced peace brought about by Tiber Septim's use of the Numidium. With it, he achieved total control of Tamriel. Once Tiber Septim completed this conquest, the Third Era and Third Empire of Man began. It was very strong initially. The Septim Empire began to hold forts in other provinces, and even laid claim to some of those provinces. Those forts were in key positions and were understandably fully stocked. As the interior of Cyrodiil was now safe from harm, and the neighboring provinces were mostly subdued, the 53 forts across this region were abandoned, left to disrepair. Their usefulness had already been declining, and now there was no need to supply resources such as food, water, weaponry, and soldiers to forts that would assuredly never see combat. This neglect led to their current status as headquarters for criminals, nests for animals, and even lairs for vampires. The Imperials of the Septim Empire are so certain of their ability and of the cost of resources that they would rather send groups to occasionally clear forts of potential issues rather than man them at all times, and so it is that we come to find them decrepit and full of budding dangers. To demonstrate the typical state of the forts, I visited Fort Cinia. Situated east of Cheydinhal and nestled into the sloping bank of the Valus Mountains, this fort has become a holdout for bandits. Clad in their ill-begotten gear, they are truly a force to be reckoned with. Their hubris is so strong that they drink often, tossing their empty bottles amongst the rest of the detritus. Perhaps the alcohol burns their bellies, keeping them warm from the ever-present snow the region is known for. The fort itself, comprised of a great many yellowed stones, has fallen into many pieces. There are multiple open sections of the walls, along with a single sad tower rising in the distance. There's an empty sconce, notably devoid of sticks, and a roaring fire. Bandits are smart when they want to be. A statue of an unnamed saint watches in disdain as his once beautiful fort now lies in ruin around him. The bandit squatters are just insult to injury. Past a strong iron door is the entrance to the fort proper. There are cobwebs across the stone walls, hinting at other unseen invaders. The saint statues hold a silent vigil for their fallen subjects, the bodies of whom are interred deep below. Nearby and very full of life are 2 bandits holding a conversation. They are adorned with extremely durable and expensive gear. They say there is no honor among thieves, but here, it seems they've made pacts to allow each other a fair share of the loot. Random fires have been lit across the ruins, lighting key points so the bandits can ambush any would-be looters from other groups. There is a great darkness throughout the ruin, with much of it cast in shadow. Bodies lay around, probably owned by the Needs who once held the fort. The bandits who have taken control have also set up traps, such as this tripwire which would launch great spiked blocks of wood toward the victim. Unlike the civilized folk of days past, bandits leave their food and drink all over the dusty stone floor. A few of them are gathered in the central hall, either resting or waiting for the order to begin their next raid. Following the tunnels, we can see one bandit getting more than he bargained for. A very decorated orc charges walking skeletons who boast sharp blades despite centuries of unuse and rust. Although the orc tries to best them and knocks one apart, the angry bones of the ancient Needs prove too much. They skulk about, daring another bandit to tempt their ire. Throughout these catacombs are coffins containing fallen Needs from untold years of the Second Empire. Even deeper in the fort is a full catacomb, further guarded by the walking dead. It's eerily quiet, the only noise coming from creaking bones which threaten to fall apart at any moment. On either side of the central hall is a large room. Here, wraiths, angry spirits, float around tombs and chests of honorary items. In the other side hall is not only a walking skeleton, but a powerful, magically imbued zombie. Whatever happened at this particular fort led its fallen inhabitants to walk the cold halls, unable to rest. These souls, belonging to or descending from ancient Nedic slaves, never seem to catch a break. Their fortresses, like their fate, lay in saddening disarray. Before we get into the theories about the forts, let us quickly discuss the loot. In your typical fort dungeon, you'll fight a mixture of undead and NPCs, the latter of which can sometimes be vampires. But as for the general loot one can expect from any given dungeon, it's mostly a collection of randomly generated chests based upon your level. As such, there will usually be small sums of gold mixed with enchanted gear. As my luck would have it, the chests in Fort Cinia were extremely lacking. All of them contained a combined value of less than 100 gold each. However, the ridiculous loot drawn from the bodies of the bandits is nothing to scoff at. They're all decked out in expensive gear ranging from dwarven to glass and even to Daedric. Since there were about 5 of them, and each piece they wear is worth thousands, one can claim a small fortune from raiding any NPC-controlled fort late in the game. As far as ingredient loot goes, we have the bone meal from the skeletons, which can be used to make potions of fire resistance, luck fortification, and night eye. We also can expect to obtain ectoplasm from the various spirit forms that roam the mausoleums. These can create potions of dispel and magic of fortification, allowing the consumer to lessen the magical combat potential of their adversary while boosting their own. The ectoplasm can also be used to make potions of shock and regular damage. The coffins in the Undercroft are mostly valueless. In this case, it may be due to the bandits having cleared house. However, none of them had much jewelry or family heirlooms on them, and the fort door had been locked prior to my entry. The orc was example enough that the fighters would have been hard-pressed to explore these rooms any earlier. Judging by experiences with other ruins, the coffins can never be expected to have much more than a few gold in terms of valuable loot. The bandits holding the fort, as well as the undead warriors in the lower segments, all make sense as far as realism goes. With all of that discussed, I would like to jump into some comments about the forts themselves. Perhaps the largest question about the forts concerns their design. The lack of long walls, multiple towers, central headquarters, etc. for each fort is surprising. In Morrowind, the forts are quite strong and realistic in terms of personnel and architecture. The argument could be made that these are newer, but that doesn't mean the Imperials couldn't refit the Cyrodiilic forts to match. Every fort in this region seems more akin to a burial bunker. The fact that most forts have but a few levels of rooms and then a burial area suggests that the Needs built each one expecting heavy losses. The best they could do was make a tower and hold out. Those that fell were interred below, and the battles continued for hundreds of years until the troops were finally told to come home. I suspect the real reason for their strange design decisions concerns playable space and disk memory. If you make the bulk of the fort an interior section, you can create a new cell which is cheaper to load than a large exterior section that also must load the sky, any wild animal mobs, trees, grass, and so on. This also gives the player another dungeon type to explore when there aren't many distinct types in the game. Also, placing the largest bit of the fort underground, as well as foregoing the exterior walls and towers, will allow more open space between locations of interest, meaning there is more room for trees and an artificial sense of the next location being further away. In a world where everything is fairly smushed together, this was probably a must. All in all, the forts could just be called towers and most people wouldn't bat an eye. As far as them being ungarrisoned, it makes sense for the reasons we discussed earlier on. However, it would make sense and even be cool for the player to be required to clear out forts in key locations for use of the Empire's soldiers in fighting back the threat of Oblivion. These could be optional quests during the main story. Maybe there is one near each town, and to cap off each successful reclamation, the player could battle an opening Oblivion portal with the newly garrisoned knights. Regardless of how they stand currently, these forts were incredibly important to the people that used them. They were held through multiple world-altering conflicts, playing host to soldiers off and on for over 500 years. Some say a selection of the forts were created during the Alessian Rebellion, making them even older. Though the truth is muddied by the waters of time, there is nothing clearer than this. Many threats have come and gone, but the empires of humanity remain. Every empire requires an efficient economy to maintain stability. Citizens can spend on needs or wants, spreading coin throughout the land. Goods and services are rendered, most are satisfied, and the cycle continues. But where does this coin come from? The septum, named after the dynasty it represents, is commonly called gold, as it is either solid or gilded with the material. It's used in every province that the empire has a hold in. All of this is well and good, but no one knows quite where it is minted. Even in the imperial city, there's no production building. At least, not an obvious one. This applies to other regions as well. It would not be a stretch to imagine that there is some sort of secret gold manufacturing facility deep below the imperial city. If we let ourselves believe this, we start to ask an even earlier question: where did the material for the gold come from? Within the crust of Cyrodiil are 24 mines, each containing veins of iron, silver, or golden ore. These can be combined and used to forge whatever the Empire may need: weapons, armor, currency, etc. Strangely, every mine in Cyrodiil is devoid of official presence. The scaffolding has been left to rot, the lanterns left to smolder, and the exploration passed on to the adventurer. As makes sense, the mines are built into caves, most often found and then dug into as the miners would follow each vein. But so many containers abound, left behind for some unknown reason. Now many of the mines are home to rats and other creatures. There's an emptiness felt here, one that makes it difficult to imagine there ever having been clang of picks on stone. The mines seem, in most cases, to be fledgling examples. The Forsaken Mine seems as though it could be fully operational if the Imperials wanted it to be. At least until we see the trolls. Great hulking beasts, with razor-sharp teeth and a strength to match, they express quite clearly why someone would leave a prospect. At least as far as this mine goes. The ironically named Abandoned Mine was, of course, abandoned by the Empire, but reclaimed by bandits. It sits just east of Lake Canulus and bores down into the ground, its entrance carved straight through the rock. Out front are a few picks hinting at the current state of work in the mine. Inside is a familiar sight, a dimly lit room propped by wooden boards. Roots hang down from some plant above ground, and the first bandit stands heavily armed against the back wall. An abandoned mine poses two benefits for a group of thieves such as this. First, it's a fully secured hideout with one entrance, meaning they could ambush and kill any trespasser. Second, there are ore veins still ripe for the picking, should they ever find the will to work for their own goods. Chests have been tossed in the corners, perhaps by the bandits trying to hide their loot from the others. A small bedroom of sorts lays in an alcove. A bedroll stretches across the ground, strangely facing the wall. 2 bottles of wine are nearby, which may have led to this poor decision. The bandits have even taken control of the connected caverns that have yet to be mined. They have a strong presence here. They've set up traps as well, ready to do what is necessary to ensure their cut of profits. The mines in Cyrodiil are perplexing. I believe many would agree that the single most important thing about the mine, other than safety, is the raw ore one can reap from it. In these mines, there is barely a nugget or two to be found per entire vein. In their raw state, silver nuggets are only worth 15 gold. Should you be lucky enough to find a gold vein in the Forsaken Mine, you can get 10 more septims per piece. This is honestly surprising. The veins seem to be almost fully made of the material, and as mentioned before, all the caves are new. There are very few segments that have been strengthened and explored by the Imperials. It's as if they only give each mine one day before they decide to find another, leaving behind whatever ore remains. In the case of the Forsaken Mine, this can be completely understood. If I were to step into the caverns and see a troll, I would pray to the gods as I tossed my pick at them in vain. As for just about every other mine on the province, there seems to be no cause for abandonment. There aren't apparent gas leaks either, as bandits, marauders, and even monsters can wander them just fine. The argument could be made that the Imperials care more about fighting off the Oblivion crisis at this time than mining for materials. But, 1, they need ore to smith weapons and armor to do that, and 2, more importantly, the mines are in the state before the first portal opens at Kvatch, so this can't be the issue. If I were to guess, based upon my travel experience, the Imperials are simply importing their ores and goods across the Abetian Sea, and from other regions they inhabit. We see how much material they get from Morrowind, for example. The Cyrodiilic mines also have no apparent stores of precious gems, although the Imperial City seems flooded with them at times. Gorgeous stones of diamond, emerald, sapphire, ruby, and topaz can be found throughout the region, just not in the mines. So they too must be imported from the other provinces. I must admit I am still confused on why not a single mining prospect is operational. The Imperials just do not care about economic efficiency at this point, it seems. Perhaps each vein offers these meager sums of usable material, in which case the discovery of even hundreds per mine may not be of any use. Apart from lore explanations, the ore almost has no use to the player. As mentioned, silver nuggets sell for 15 septims, and gold for 25. If one has the Mehrunes Razor DLC, they can acquire scrolls of transmutation, which allow the alchemical conversion of one material to the next highest form, following the order of iron, silver, then gold. Even then, it's almost never worth it to extract these minerals. What is worth it then? That comes down to the specific mine. NPCs are almost always decked out in valuable gear, so there's that. The chests, even those with hard locks, have basically nothing in them. This hard chest had 67 gold in it, only 2 away from greatness. Click the like button. There are ingredients from the leveled creatures as well. As we have covered things like rat and crab meat, I will add in just the troll fat that can be acquired without fail from the Forsaken Mine. It can be used to make potions of personality fortification. How that connects to the trolls, I'm not sure. Perhaps it suggests that your wild stories of battling trolls can make you seem more charismatic. The other effects seem more in line. They're all poisons which damage health, willpower, and agility. I would like to revisit that bedroll I mentioned before. Although funny at first glance, it does conjure questions. This is not the only location in which the bedrolls have the sleeper facing the wall. Even in the forts we see this. What benefit does this bring them? One would imagine that you'd be on your guard at all times, especially as a bandit being part of a misfit crew with a tenuous alliance. So you would face your bed toward the open space with your back to the wall. There you go. You can thank me later. Outside the mines are usually leveled creatures that seem to guard their entrance. In the case of the Forsaken Mine, we have a beautiful and vicious Spriggan in her natural habitat. She stands confident, waiting for prey to arrive. The falling rain sets the tone for what is sure to be a dangerous experience underground, as if the skulls on spikes didn't hint at this. Mushrooms make use of the warm, damp climate to grow massive caps. Weather here could not be more different than near the abandoned mine where all is sunny. Even the wolves and deer get along. Though the mines are only useful for claiming loot from raiders, they still have a tiny bit of charm about them, about as much as the ore you can reclaim from the veins. Picture this. You're walking through the county of Kvatch, swept along by its golden grasses and the gentle wind that faces little resistance. Your favorite spot to read is just over the hill, obscured from any potential distractions. The weather's nice and you can see the tall timbers coming into view. But then, something else. Out of nowhere, the sky becomes angry, a deep red with nebulous streaks of what seem to be magma, then another surprise. A great portal made of dark, sharp, and jagged material. Its interior flames with wavering blasts of heat, never ending. Through it, vile creatures in unfamiliar forms crawl. They claw their way out, taking in the view of the world they invade. You turn and run, your reading material dropping to the dirt behind you. With every step, a question. What do I say to my family? Will anyone believe me? Is this the apocalypse? Soon they'll be forced to believe you. Everyone left, that is, for you have just sighted one of many Oblivion Gates, each containing an evil the likes of which most in your realm have never witnessed. The Oblivion crisis of the 433rd year of the Third Era was one of the largest disasters ever to affect Tamriel. Gates appeared all over the continent, allowing followers and minions of Mehrunes Dagon to break through and attack. Thanks to the Mythic Dawn, a fanatical group of zealots devoted to this Daedric prince, the portals allowed unchecked mayhem to wreak havoc upon the world. All of this was done so that Mehrunes Dagon could eventually step through and control Tamriel, the one location that has always been out of his grasp. The portals sprung up in about 60 places within the province of Cyrodiil alone. The landing area of each one is patrolled by creatures of Oblivion, including many different types of Daedra. For example, the demonic Zivali or the elemental Atronox. Stepping inside one of the portals brings the traveler to an extremely disturbing scene. Here they exist in the Oblivion realm of Mehrunes Dagon, one of 17 princes, each controlling their own realms. This realm is known as the Deadlands. Alone, the adventurer wanders among vicious demonic minions while being dwarfed by massive, brutal towers, brimming with razor-sharp spikes. The largest of which, the Sigil Keep, is the only hope at closing the portal. Large stones with inscribed runes can be translated into a confusing paradox which reads, "Here is no, there is no," in repeating fashion. The adventurer is greeted with a dead horse dragged from the human world to be tortured and consumed. A Dremora stands alongside it, awaiting orders from his patron. The portal, the only known way back to the familiar world, is surrounded by blood grasses, ostensibly drawing nutrients from the common sacrifices performed here. The chaotic, frantic placement of walls is disarming, and the great spikes within them drip with blood of unknown beings. A great, endless sea of lava burns and belches nearby, offering no escape should one leave the land. Torturous machines are unavoidable, such as this flame turret, which spins and charges a firebolt toward the nearest target. A Daedroth stands nearby, his great maw terrifying. Spider Daedra also walk the lands, grotesque combinations of woman and arachnid. Within the towers are macabre experiments, displays of torturous recreation completed by the Daedra. The poor souls of these bodies may never have left before being brought here, meaning they could very well be cognizant of what is happening to them, a perpetual anguish. This trap seems to be malfunctioning for some reason, as they often fall to the floor of the tower, leaving one impaled. Beneath the towers of these islands are molten caves. This one is filled to the brim with Daedroths. Found occasionally throughout the islands are containers made from sacks of flesh. If an adventurer chooses to brave the towers, they run a great risk. Inside are the fiercest of Dagon's warriors, and they'll stop at nothing to prevent the destruction of the nearest portal. Another type of container that can be found is the Punished. Some sort of living matter from a disastrously unlucky being who has been stretched taut and cursed with eternal life. As mentioned before, the evils of this realm are uncontended. Spiked cages occasionally hold an unlucky human. If released, they'll only fall to their death below. A Dremora walks the parapets, on guard for intruders. As one enters the great door to the Sigil Tower, they can expect to face the most ruthless warriors of the island. A great beam of fire erupts from the center of the tower and reaches skyward from within. This is the source of power allowing the portal to remain open. All along the interior edges of the tower are ramps and walkways that could allow an intruder to interfere with Dagon's plans. Many of the warriors here are prepared, some wearing full sets of Daedric armor and weapons. In the side halls are various traps, placed within cramped rooms that add a quiet sense of unease. If an adventurer makes it to the Sigil Sanctum, they're met with another disturbing sight. The flame from below is sent upward, passing through a black, spherical stone of unknown origin. It is held contained by spikes and chains. Walkways are made of the flesh of unlucky souls who likely feel the pain of every step upon their sinew. Should an adventurer be so lucky as to survive and take the Sigil Stone, the entire tower will collapse, blasting them out and into the mortal realm once more. But there, in the ground, are the charred remains of an evil portal forever on. And nearby, as if that wasn't enough, is an unfortunate person who may or may not have just passed through the area, hoping to read a story and ease their stress. Now they look ever onward toward a town they never made it back to. The Oblivion portals are a grand example of just how vile, disgusting, and evil the Daedric princes can be. There's no remorse, no subtlety, just plain vicious disrespect for the sanctity of life. The chaotic appearance of the structures is confusing, immediately throwing off any sense of familiar order. The bloody spikes all over the place, the bodies strung about, they all stand as warnings to the player that they may not escape this place. But if they do, they have a lot to show for it. There are over 90 potential locations for the 60 gates to spawn at. Each takes you to a different world. There are a total of 7 random worlds, as well as 7 that are specific to certain locations. Most of the portals in Cyrodiil will randomly transport you to one of 7 worlds that can be reset through saving beforehand. There is a reason to do this, which I will explain in a moment. Of the 7 non-random worlds, 2 of them belong to other Daedric princes, Peryite and Vermina. My only complaint about them is that their realms look near identical to that of Mehrunes Dagon. In future titles this would definitely change. Discussions of realism can basically be thrown out the window for this section. There's nothing that can prepare you for, or properly explain, a demonic realm that exists outside of space and linear time. The fact that the adventurer can close the gate and return to a world that is anything close to familiar, let alone the same time and place, is amazing. Many say the hero of Kvatch is nothing special, but it's interesting that he seems to be able to do this. Now onto the loot. Not only can full sets of Daedric gear be found in these portals, but tons of rare ingredients and weapons as well. Some of the more important items are the unique set of Hatred's weapons. Found only in Random World 2, there exists a bow called Hatred's Soul, which, along with Hatred's Soul arrows, can inflict the most base damage across any weapons in the title. One could also find Hatred's Heart, a strong Daedric mace. This is the world you would try and reset for if you wanted to. You know you're there when you spawn in facing south and see 7 towers total. Back to the loot. Reaching these items is dangerous. Even the plants are vicious, such as this Harada, which whips its spiked tendrils toward the adventurer. This is a great place to discuss the ingredients available in Dagon's Plane of Oblivion. Harada can be used to make potions of health and magic damage, as well as paralysis and silence. This is a very strong poison, especially if used as a single ingredient with maximum alchemy level. Bloodgrass can be used to blend in with the environment like a chameleon, resist paralysis, or fortify health. The last of the plants in the realm, the spittle stick, is from more hostile vegetation. It can create poisons of health, magicka, and fire damage. Combined with general foods, it strangely produces fatigue restoration potions. Within the Oblivion portals are a whole host of Daedra, offering ingredients that are rare anywhere else. To start, one can use scamp skin to make poisons similar to the plants of the region. It can also boast shock resistance and damage reflection, which is odd considering the scamps are so weak. Either way, that last effect is really good. Adult Clanfear can drop claws which produce paralysis and health poisons, or, alternatively, potions of disease cure and resistance. All the more reason to cut them down. Next are the Atronachs. The Flame Atronach drops fire salts used to create poisons of fire damage, or poisons of frost resistance, flame shield, and magicka restoration. Frost Atronachs will drop frost salts, which create poisons of frost damage and silence, disallowing an opposing mage to respond. They can also make potions of frost shield and fire resistance, mirroring the fire salts. Void salts, found from Storm Atronachs, will produce potions of magicka restoration and fortification, while also dispelling any negative effects on the drinker. It can also make a basic poison, as with many things. No wonder these Atronachs are always summoned by mages. Their benefits are phenomenal. Next we have the large Daedroth, which drop their fangs upon death. These can be used to make potions of Night Eye, Frost Shield, and Light. These are all really interesting. The only thing that seems to have a connection to their Daedric origins is the common Frost Shielding. After the Daedroth is the Spider Daedra, which can drop 2 unique ingredients. The first, Daedra Silk, can create a potion of Night Eye and Chameleon, allowing one to see with great advantage while also disappearing. The second, Daedra Venom, can make poisons of paralysis and health damage, with calls to mind a vision of Spider Daedra wrapping their enemies in a cocoon before injecting them. They can also match with Scamp Skin to make potions of damage reflection. Lastly, we have Daedra Hearts. Dropping from Dremora and Zivali, these ingredients can be used to restore health and provide a shock shield for whatever reason. They can also make potions that simultaneously deplete your opponent's magicka stores while also preventing them from using what they have left. A business harvesting ingredients in Oblivion could be quite lucrative. Maybe the Dawn was onto something. The sigil stones acquired at the end of each gate closing will have a leveled, randomized enchantment that can be applied to a weapon or armor, depending on the effect. This consumes the stone, but it's completely worth it as it is used for nothing else. That wraps up the loot discussion. The portals can usually be counted on to bring you thousands in gold, as well as great alchemy materials. As far as how the dungeon feels to play through, I have mixed opinions. It can sometimes feel like a slog to wade through so many repeated buildings, or to find a portal only to spawn in the same world you closed last. Although this is another looting opportunity, I typically make sure I complete Random World 2, then only do the others as necessary. The non-random worlds are cool, as they're crafted to be different experiences, but those are not the general dungeon type we're describing in the video. The repetition can cause these dungeons to lose luster, although their specific style cannot be denied. The fact that one can adventure within a Daedric realm is very interesting. Alas, I'll take the sigils only as they're specifically necessary to defeating the plans of the Mythic Dawn and Mehrunes Dagon. Of all the gates to Oblivion, only one formed over water, bringing with it a small island. It's covered in strange flora and hosts a gate which looks nothing like the rest. Great stone faces merge, between the teeth of which are a bluish portal to Oblivion, but this is clearly not the realm of Mehrunes Dagon. Entering the portal, one will find themselves in the Shivering Isles, the Oblivion realm of Sheogorath. Like the Mad God himself, the land is twisted and strange. In fact, the entire realm is split nearly in two. On either side of the split are two distinct landscapes. The northern half is called Mania. It's a beautiful and dangerous biome full of gorgeous flora, including giant mushrooms and colorful trees. It also hosts the most insane people and beasts. Dementia is dark and gloomy, and feels as hopeless as Mania does crazy. In both regions are caves, and they're always formed by the twisting roots of giant trees. Strangely enough, these trees never seem to be complete, almost as if a giant entity hacked them off above the base, leaving only a stump. Surrounding these cave entrances are often the denizens found within, such as the insect-like elytra, or the strange living trees called gnarls. Below these giant stumps are caverns likely made from growth and recession of the roots of other gargantuan plant species. Then again, nothing much makes sense in the Shivering Isles. From the ceiling hang roots searching for something from which to draw nutrients. A strange greenish mist can be seen in lower segments. Within these caverns are also amber tree limbs containing a solid substance that can be extracted and used to form armor and weapons. This will be discussed later on in more detail. One will also come across many of the elytra mentioned before, including their leaders, the elytra matrons. The glow of their backs is unmistakable. The matrons also have a sort of biological crown, cementing their rightful place as leaders. Another hazard within the caverns are the hollow stumps covered in green pustules and releasing a cloud of noxious gas. If one is quick, they can reach inside the stumps for some potential loot or alchemical aid. A waterlogged chamber leads to a wide open room. The fungal species from outside the caves also live within, apparently comfortable in either atmosphere. A bouquet of fungal species surrounds a hollow poisoned stump. Stomping nearby is a scalon, an amphibious beast of amazing power. They often turn themselves invisible, lurking in the water until prey is near enough to ambush. Their glowing eyes and razor-sharp teeth offer no quarter. Here we see a ballywog, generally a surface creature. It's an early life stage of the Grummite species. The waterlogged areas may have aided in their spawn, but they typically could not survive alone, especially in the domain of gnarls and elytra. As if summoned, a gnarl stands near another fungal bouquet. It sways hypnotically, as though its head was a tangle of branches in the wind. Amongst the twigs are eyeballs, suggesting this is the method through which the gnarl observes its world, either alongside or instead of the green eye shapes seen on the face. Either that, or those are the ocular remnants of oblivious passers-by. These mushrooms seem to grow in pairs. How fortunate. As one ventures deeper, they come to understand why there were ballywogs before. In this room, a great battle has broken out between the surface-dwelling Grummites and the darkness-loving elytra. Pincers strike, clubs bash, and even magic makes its way into the mix. As the battle rages, the ruins of previous human structures sits in the background. The bloodshed is observed by Grummite totems, sporting faces of discontentment. This is representative of the region of Dementia, one heavily infested with Grummites. As one moves through the cavern, there's a definite shift in fungal flora. Things have become darker, a little more grim. The cavern reaches into ruins of an ancient man-made building. Grummite eggs lay scattered across the stone. Even the Grummites like to drink, by the look of things. They have taken complete control of this old structure and have even erected a representational statue of themselves. With each passing step, the cavern becomes stranger. A tilted door leads to further ruin connections. Inside is a green flame, perpetuated by what could only be magic. Stone pillars try to support an empty hall. Reaching a final chamber, it's clear that the Grummites have begun to take control of the entire cavern. Their fledgling tribe has entered through a cave in Dementia and has begun to work their way to Mania. Back on the Dementia side of things, the Grummites have controlled the pool and used it to spawn. Their eggs hang in clutches suspended from mossy stones. A Grummite mage carries a staff and sports jewelry made from crabs and pearls. If only they could converse with the humans, perhaps there could be some sort of peace. But those teeth do not hint at agreement. These caves are some of the strangest and most interesting dungeons in the entire game. They're filled with such beautiful and, sometimes ugly, creatures that give even the best adventurer a run for their gold. The occasional merging of natural caverns with anthropogenic ruins is very cool. It almost calls to question the mechanisms which led to this arrangement. However, if you try to attribute logic to something within the Shivering Isles, you'll take psychic damage. The creatures in this expansion could have been reskins of rats, trolls given magical abilities, or something simple like that. Instead, entirely new monsters were created, all of them unique and interesting when compared to what the mainland of Cyrodiil can offer. I particularly like the elytra for some reason. I've always been interested in entomology, something that Morrowind likely had a hand in. So, seeing their behavior makes me imagine how they would interact with the Kwama, should a secret portal to the Isles open in an egg mine. As far as loot goes, these caverns are fantastic. The empty poison stumps are a unique interaction with the container, requiring a timed accession like with plants in the Deadlands. Although the loot in these stumps isn't great, it's still fun to try your hand. Sometimes the contents are surprising. As for the other hollow limbs, the amber material is incredibly important. It's not intrinsically valuable, but a certain smith can forge it into armaments for you. This results in a set of light armor and weapons which glisten with hardened sap. They also call to mind Halloween with the sickly green between pieces of orange. This armor is the best light armor in the game in terms of starting stats. The other containers all hold small level gear that can amount to 100 gold or so each. Sometimes a randomly generated magic item can appear, which is cool too. Of more importance than obvious loot is the vast set of alchemical ingredients one can gain from these dungeons. Beginning with flora, one can expect to come across the following. Prepare yourself. Blind Watcher's Eyes, Flame Stalks, Screaming Maws, Mushroom Tree Saplings, Root Stalks, Root Pods, Regular Watcher's Eyes, Black Tar Mushrooms, Rot Scale, Thorn Hooks, and Withering Moon Fungal Bodies. Seeing as there are so many of these and we've not even begun to discuss the ingredients from the creatures, I will only list what I find to be the most useful effects in my travels. Blind Watcher's Eyes can be sold to a certain person for 200 gold apiece, and have the same alchemical properties as their unimpaired relatives. They can make potions of magic fortification and spell reflection. Flame Stalks can make invisibility potions. Screaming Maw can restore health. It can also combine with whisk cores from root stalks to make potions of chameleon. Waterroot pod pits can allow one to breathe water. Withering Moon can make the most amazing potion of all these, restoring one's magical reserves while also granting them a shield against regular damage, a cure for any common disease, and spell reflection. For the avid alchemist, this would be a waste to pass up. Now to the creatures. Elytras drop Ichor, which can grant chameleon and magic restoration. It can also make a poison to prevent opponents from casting spells. Gnarls drop their bark. Strange to know, but every time I see Gnarl bark, I think of a certain 2006 Billboard hit that was released in the same month as this game. Strange coincidence, but one I enjoy. This bark can be used to grant shielding from regular and flame damage. They can also drop amber at times. Scalons drop their fins, which can pair with the waterroot pod pits to make water-breathing potions. The various stages of Grummite and Valleywog can drop pearls as well as Madness Ore, which we will discuss in the next segment. The Grummites also have these trilobite-esque shields that I just wanted to mention because I think they're great. Like with certain other dungeons, I find the ultimate reward here to be the alchemical potential of the inhabitant species. That and the amber one can find. Overall, I think these caves are fun to explore, and Knotbone Chamber takes the cake with its plethora of flora and creatures, structural styles, container variety, with very enjoyable sounds, and finally the underground connection that leads the adventurer from one side of the Shivering Isles to the other. Fantastic stuff. Much like in the mortal realm, the devotees of Daedric patrons love to build shrines. That's what many of the ruins in the Shivering Isles seem to be, though some theorize they had been built by Grummites who once held a higher level of society. This would explain the statue we had seen before. However, there are all sorts of intricate designs that seem all too human, statues of mortal shape. There's a potential explanation for all of this, one that could, if necessary, make sense on how both statements can be correct. At the end of every era within the Shivering Isles, an event begins which is known as the Grey March. In this, the forces of order battle the forces of chaos, resulting in utter destruction of the realm. This requires Sheogorath to rebuild it once more, thus beginning the cycle anew. Now, as far as this relates to the ruins, it's commonly suggested that each of these locations was the achievement of some society before that era's Grey March wiped them out. Hence, one society could have built their ruins, the races of the next era could have replicated it, and so on. Of course, that is if you're trying to make sense of things in the Shivering Isles, which is a fool's endeavor. Rather than wax about their possible origins, it would benefit the adventurer to explore them. Deep in the northern reaches of Mania are the ruins of Can. Resting below the beautiful firmament, these ruins are made of white stone, cracking and eroding over untold millennia. As we mortals understand it, this realm does not follow a linear time frame. Only Sheogorath himself could know how many cycles of the Grey March have been repeated, and even then, would he be telling the truth? Up the steps of stone are massive green fungal stalks, amazing in their capacity to triple caps and grow through one another. On either side of the grand entrance to these ruins are marble faces, taunting those who dare enter. The view inside the doors can fill one with a similar sense of unease. Lit only by dancing flame, the shadows of mortals are cast about. These specific ruins are filled with heretics, those who would deny the word of Sheogorath. Being himself, the Mad God sees no danger from these fools. Instead, he enjoys watching their fate unfold, and, one could imagine, taking an active role in it. Far scarier than the Grummite statues, one can see the grotesque forms of Hunger Daedra, immortalized in stone. They watch silently, almost as if prepared to come alive and feast on the heretics below. Urns of mysterious purpose sit on either side of a stone brazier, neither filled with remains. Throughout the crumbling halls are bare walls and cold feelings. Whoever used to roam here was not interested in comfort, only purpose. Further down, one finds a hall of statues, each depicting a mortal in various states of emotion. Perhaps those who lived here worshipped the Hunger as a minor set of deities. Their form seems to be depicted in a much grander scale. Found often in ruins are deposits of madness ore. Their true makeup is something of a mystery, though at each spiky pile, one can see the hands of unfortunate victims reaching toward the sky. This implied they were victims of a previous Grey March, if we take that initial discussion as truth. In reverse fashion of Gnawbone Chamber, the ruins connect in part to a root system. Stalking within are the ravenous demons themselves, the Hunger. Their accursed bodies remain frail at all times, their only desire being sustenance. It's as if everything they eat finds a void in the pit of their shriveled stomachs, never being harvested of the energy it has to offer. Images of malevolent faces can be pushed to activate contraptions of ancient design. This one simply halts the flames erupting from this Hunger statue's great maw. Further evidence of Hunger worship exists in this room, depicting many mortals which look up upon their apparent superiors. After traveling through another natural cavern, one will find themselves in a large arena room, complete with stands upon which ancient patrons could watch the performance. Statues of both mortals and Hunger look down upon the combatants, as if reminding them of their current dilemma. In the corner of this room is a massive surprise. On the floor, surrounded by other crumpled attempts, one of the zealots has written a scroll. Apparently the zealots had aimed to create something known as the Elaborate Spectacle. A performance of spoken word and displays of compassion would be held in the adjacent arena. It would bring people together against the wishes of the mad god who bids chaos reign. However, as the zealots snatched people from the nearby swamps and brought them here, the victims would assume the worst. They would prepare to die. Despite the zealots bringing them fine foods and wines, they still felt uneasy. Eventually, the trapped people would be given quill and ink and told to prepare for the event. Confused, they instead wrote letters to their loved ones as well as insults toward their captors. The zealots could not understand why they didn't practice poetry. When asked for their choice of clothing, the abductees requested armor, something none of the zealots had on hand. Finally, the prisoners were brought together in the arena. When they were, they immediately set to battling one another, regardless of the original purpose. Each time this occurred, the zealots would try again with a new couple. Ironically, this is one of the definitions of madness, doing the same thing over and over, with the expectation of different results. I find it so morbidly funny that these poor souls mistook a poetry jam session as a life and death situation, if only they had listened to their captors. Within the cells are bodies of people who trained. Some of their rooms have gear with which to do so, calling to question whether these were requested by the captors, or if the zealots simply wanted to distance themselves from what they had done by creating an elaborate story. I choose to believe in the finger-snapping shindig. Either way, the victims all found themselves dead, either at the hands of their fellow prisoners or by the end of their own blade. No matter the outcome, most of the bodies were dumped into a pit, ready for consumption by a group of Hunger. Perhaps the elaborate spectacle was the irony we made along the way. These ruins are quite unique and can be downright scary to traverse. While many are filled with mortals, others can house creatures of mysterious origin, such as the shambles, hulking amalgamations of bone and rope. Their knees are made of skulls, their faces made of some beast's own visage. This jaw and upper skull may be from a scalon. The spikes could be from any number of the Isle's creatures. There are also flesh creatures such as the skinned hound and flesh atternox. As far as loot goes, the containers don't offer much beyond random potions, small sums of gold, and maybe a random piece of gear. The deposits of madness ore are the primary treasure to be acquired here. A certain person in the town of Crucible can fashion these materials into heavy armor and weapons, known as the madness gear. This armor has the highest base stat for heavy armor in all the realms. Both the wearable pieces and weapons are covered in depictions of faces. Some are jovial, some angry, but all can instill fear in the opponent. The helmet doesn't seem to make practical sense, but as we've discussed, yada yada. For all we know, it could have a secret enchantment that makes one able to see through it. Regardless of these details, this is one of the coolest armors ever designed by those in the realms defined by the Elder Scrolls. As many of these dungeons are inhabited by mortals, their loot can be assumed. The creatures in these ruins drop unique alchemical materials. Hungers drop their tongues, which cure poison and disease. Shambles drop shards and marrow, which can create poisons of various types. Hound teeth can cure poison, allow one to detect life through a visual aura, and also become invisible. Although I did not come across any in my travels, it is said that flesh atternox will drop void essence, a mineral that produces incredible potions of health restoration, as well as health, strength, and endurance fortification. These ruins, regardless of how they were created, are quite interesting to walk through. One never knows what a smiling switch will do, and the madness ore never fails to brighten a day. Well, at least that of the adventurer. As mentioned earlier, there was a team of around 70 people who worked on Oblivion. When discussing Morrowind, we were left with a little less information about who did what part of dungeon design. Luckily, we have a development documentary that highlights some of the key people behind these new dungeons, such as the lead dungeon designer, East Von Pelly. Todd Broadwater was one of the designers as well. He says he loves creating the creepy and scary, and that can definitely be felt within some of the caves. He also highlights the addition of traps into the game's dungeons, as it was a new feature not really seen in Morrowind. Something he says here is really interesting. It's a note about the visual storytelling that Bethesda is fairly good at.
But also, give people questions as to why it's there and what it stands for, because that could be more interesting in what you read into it rather than the literal. You know, what your mind imagines sometimes is far cooler than what the reality is of situations.
Other than these two, there were 6 people who helped design the dungeons. They are as follows: Tim Lindsay, Frank Ward, Michael E. Ryan, Robert Wisniewski, Jeff Brown, and Joel Burgess. Speaking of Joel Burgess, he did an interview with USA Today in 2022, which shed a lot of light on things. Apparently he was hired on when the game was almost completely done. He was told to make 20 dungeons in 2 weeks. That sounded like a wild goal, but it makes sense once you hear what he said next. There were warehouse cells in the game where you could copy selections of pre-built segments for any dungeon you were trying to build. You'd copy these, paste them in your new interior cell, stitch them together, make some minor changes, and boom, it's a new dungeon. Luckily, I'm able to show some of them here. This is very eye-opening for how the dungeons were created by so few people. In Burgess's case, he made 2 a day. That's not all he did though. He built Vilverin, the first Ayleid Ruin sighted once you leave the Imperial City sewers. It was made by scratch, not with pieces from the warehouses. His reason being that the dungeons all began to feel similar, and even the placement and arrangement of containers was painfully obvious. This is part of why Vilverin feels so unique. Burgess also added little notes and things to make the dungeons feel more connected to the overland world, while also adding some puzzles and things. As this impressed the higher-ups, Burgess and the rest of the team were given 1 month to improve as many dungeons as possible with this mentality. They completed changes to 12 different dungeons. That's not all. Burgess and another unnamed designer were responsible for creating the entire Mehrunes Razor dungeon themselves. They did it while bored, then presented it to management, who told them to finish polishing it. This dungeon became the center of a quest DLC, one that Oblivion players probably recognize. All of these people did an incredible job working on a combined total of, by the definition of this video, 265 dungeons. The sheer size of these dungeons can be staggering at times, giving one the feeling of being trapped in an actual cave. It's good stuff. When I first saw the screenshots and trailers for Oblivion, I could not believe my eyes. I genuinely thought it was all fake. The graphics, the AI.
Greetings. Goodbye.
It all seemed so amazing. As we discussed in the introduction section for this game, Oblivion's dungeons are able to respawn. This can artificially inflate the number of dungeons you can explore indefinitely. It's almost necessary considering you can complete pretty much all the content on a single character, which will lengthen your playtime. Without dungeons to clear between missions, things might start to get stale. This can be a positive, allowing you to have fun and revisit previously cleared locations. If you swept all of them from left to right, and passed at minimum 10 in-game days, you could virtually restart each of them from the left again and they would be new. This is not exactly the case, but is essentially the thought behind the process. Morrowind did not have respawning dungeons. Once you cleared them, that was it. But, in Morrowind, there are many mutually exclusive decisions, especially surrounding factions. Joining the Fighters Guild can bar you from some Thieves Guild content, for example. This means you typically need to complete multiple playthroughs in order to do all the game has to offer. This also means that you'll be able to do the dungeons again on a new character, with new leveled loot and a fresh experience. In Oblivion, it can feel as though you haven't left a mark on the world. It does make sense from a realism perspective that some other group would inhabit the dungeon you cleared, but it should take more than 10 in-game days for that to occur. Either way, the Oblivion dungeons have a benefit that protects that issue from notice. They're huge. Even the smaller dungeons can be compared with average-sized dungeons from Morrowind. Much of the space in these newer dungeons might primarily be set dressing, and the increased movement speed of the player would make traveling a Morrowind-sized dungeon a little too quick, but they are enjoyable nonetheless. The overall combination of dungeon crawling and the fallout of ancient races, historic wars, realms of the hellish Oblivion, and the manic delusions of a Daedric prince is one that provides not only fun and engagement, but also a host of memories that long outlive complaints of realism and repetition. Just north of Cyrodiil is Skyrim, home of the Nords. This land is beautiful, with many biomes ranging from frozen waste to idyllic countrysides. There are huge mountains, the peaks of which are only climbed by those worthy of the task, and in some cases they must be called to do so. Unfortunately, in the 201st year of the Fourth Era, there are major disruptions that pull the Nords from their once comfortable lives. High King Torygg, the ruler of Skyrim, was killed by a man named Ulfric Stormcloak. Ulfric wants Skyrim to secede from the Empire and get out from under their control. This led to a civil war that is still raging across the province, pitting friends and family against one another. And to top it off, dragons have now returned to the region, led by a great winged beast known as Alduin. Luckily for the people of Skyrim, a nondescript prisoner happens to be Dragonborn, a wielder of ancient magic, and may just help them unite under a common cause, saving their beloved homeland. Most of the content in the Elder Scrolls V takes place in the titular province, though there are a couple DLCs which expand the playable area. The dungeons one can experience include your standard caves, forts, Dwemer Ruins, and more. By the definition of this video, there are 172 dungeons in the game, divided between 7 total types. Unlike the previous titles, Skyrim was created in something called the Creation Kit, a more refined and efficient toolbox than the old construction set. The development team for Skyrim consisted of around 100 people, with around 10 being directly involved with the creation of the dungeons. At the end of the Skyrim segment, we'll touch more on this topic. Some things of note before we begin. Skyrim behaves a lot differently than the previous 2 titles. There are many perks which change what exactly appears within loot, meaning that any 2 players' experiences could be different. When considering how to do a fair and generalized assessment of dungeons in the game, I opted to avoid any perks that increased loot quality, gold amounts, etc. Also, there are many Radiant quests which can affect the number, level, rewards, and more of different dungeons. Nearly every dungeon is connected to some type of quest. To show what the dungeons themselves have to offer, I did not take any quests, Radiant or otherwise, that would be connected to one of these dungeons. Like in Oblivion, dungeons will respawn their inhabitants and loot within 10 to 30 days. However, a small but incredibly useful quality of life improvement was implemented. When you beat the boss of a dungeon, an audio cue will play to let you know you've completed the location. It will also show on the map. Most dungeons have a boss, much like in Oblivion. There are easy out systems, also having come from the previous title. The issue of visual skylights with no overland connections persists here as well. To round out the random notes, Blackreach will not be covered extensively in the video. This is because it does not have any counterparts and does not count as a type of dungeon. Believe me, as someone who appreciates the Dwemer, I would love to eventually speak about it down the road. Finally, the following dungeons were explored with a high-level character, with minimal shouts, no companions, and no dungeon-altering mods. All of these checks were put in place to ensure the most accurate depiction of each location as a player experience. Now let's get into the dungeons, beginning with one of my favorites. Not only did the Dwemer lay claim to many areas of modern-day Morrowind, they also reached over and under the Velothi Mountains. They found themselves in Skyrim, and as was common for the dwarves, they began warring with the natives there. While fending off Nordic raiders, the Dwemer spent a great amount of time studying the region, specifically its cave systems. They soon discovered a gargantuan cavern known as Falzardum Dene, or, in the Nordic tongue, Blackreach. Within one stretch of this cavern was a great source of what the Dwemer called Aetherium. Calling to mind the Welkind and Varla stones of the Ayleids, we can comfortably assume this material was thought to fall from the sky. It is a magical crystal, also turquoise in color. A great forge was built, and the dwarves began experimenting with its inclusion in armor and weaponry. There were 4 Dwemer city-states in the region, each a different clan unto themselves. As all of them wanted access and, eventually, control of the Aetherium forge, a war broke out between them. This set of battles, of course, came to be known as the Aetherium Wars, and even weakened the Dwemer so much that they were temporarily conquered by the Nords. Sealing the forge away for good, the Dwemer agreed to put aside their differences and take back their homes. After this success, they further demonstrated their intent by distributing 4 pieces of the Aetherium crest, a key of sorts, amongst all 4 clans. Never again would this dangerous substance be the source of war between the Dwemer clans of Skyrim. As the Dwemer returned to their lives, they continued to excavate and make use of the other benefits of Blackreach. They built great fortresses above ground from carved stone, researched tonal architecture, and crafted mechanical wonders as they had in the other regions. Eventually, a war broke out on the surface between the Nords and the Snow Elves. These elves were almost completely wiped out. Seeking refuge from their fellow Mer, the remaining snow elves requested to move into the dwarven facilities. This was granted, and the elves rejoiced at being able to survive this near genocide of their people. If they could have seen the future, they may have gone to the axe willingly. The secret of Dwemer, not trusting other races around their technology, poisoned the snow elves with mushrooms endemic to Blackreach. These caused the elves to go blind, their eyes now as useless as they felt within the deep dark caverns. Unable to lead themselves around, they were made into slaves for the dwarves. After many hundreds of years, the snow elves began to degenerate into what we now call the Falmer. Such an intelligent race suffered at the hands of not one, but two others, both ruthless and devoid of mercy. After much suffering, as with the Nordic slaves of Cyrodiil, the Falmer began a rebellion. This started a war that lasted right up until the moment the Dwemer race vanished, all due to the events at Red Mountain. From that point on, the Falmer had no contestants in Blackreach. They began farming chorus beasts, and taking the meticulously crafted dwarven homes as their own. Although betrayed and degenerated, the snow elves would live on. As for today, many of the ruins are plundered for their goods. This is still banned by imperial law, meaning whatever pieces are stolen can be sold for a heavy sack of gold, mostly to collectors. It seems the Empire never will have access to all the secrets of the Dwemer. The ancient cities found within Skyrim have notably distinct architecture, as they were built by different clans. There are less towers and more walls of similar height. The mysterious metals used in Vardenfell are only used as accents here, the bulk of the strongholds made from quarried stone. Found in the northernmost reaches of Skyrim, the ruins of Mazinchileft are one of 8 major Dwemer structures in the region. They're being plundered by a large group of smugglers. These people take turns standing, or rather sitting, guard against any approaching Imperial parties, ready to flee at a moment's notice. Inside, the remnants of Dwemer society are on display. Large metal pipes spew steam as icicles drip from the ceiling. Dwarven spiders, the most numerous of the automatons, have been defeated in combat by the smugglers, their metal carapaces left to rust. An eerie green glow lights a hallway, metal barriers protecting ancient pipe systems. If an invader were to enter, they would be prime targets for attack. The smugglers rest in the entryway, a fire lit to keep themselves warm. The hallways of the ruins are just as dangerous as one would imagine, pillars of stone having crumbled over time. Moving deeper into the ruins, we can see just how much the smugglers have succeeded here. Their numbers are great, and they have brought enough provisions to last them an entire excavation period. In the Great Hall, they find themselves battling with the Silent Protectors, centurions made from heavy ancient metals. This must have been the extent of their foray, as the remaining halls bore many dangers, including Dwemer spiders imbued with shock capabilities. Rolling out from gaps in the walls, Centurion spheres will mercilessly attack any invaders. They can emerge from their mobile forms within seconds, ready to swing metal lances or send bolts from mounted crossbows. A lift takes one deeper into the subterranean layers of Skyrim, leading them to an ancient city now infested with Falmer. This city is within a huge cavern, one with standing water and ample room to escape it. There are great bridges of stone which connect pathways above, as though they thought ahead for issues such as this. Walking these bridges, the Falmer stand guard against the noises they heard above. Though their sight has been removed, their other senses, such as smell and hearing, have only become more refined. It's such a shame to look upon these beasts and realize what Tamriel has lost in their once brilliant minds. Here we see a chorus spawning area with eggs strewn about the place in piles. A single chorus creature watches over them, eating small bugs that skitter across the stone. A ballista sits unmanned, drawing an ironic sense of hubris. Rather than rest in beds made by their enemies, the Falmer constructs small tents, ostensibly made from the carapaces of chorus beasts, much like their armor and weaponry. The flags of ancient Dwemer clans still hang, another ironic sight to behold. A conference hall sits empty of attendees. This was most likely a place to host meetings about recent discoveries, war plans, etc. The 3 seats suggest a trio of leaders, though these clans were known to have one king each. Nearby, a Falmer mage battles alongside a chorus creature. This shows that, although they have lost much, some of the Falmer still retain connections to their ancient heritage as magic wielders. Just over the wall, a beautiful fountain sits, spewing water which now sustains the Falmer. In a final chamber stands a hulking menace of a machine. A steam centurion, standing easily twice the height of the common Mer, bides its time until awoken by invaders. As a centurion sphere distracts, the centurion blasts superheated steam, hoping to melt away enemies. Should this fail, it also has mounted hammers and axes with which to tear apart flesh. This steam centurion is perhaps expected by adventurers that make it this far. However, should the surface elevator be utilized from outside, the occupant may not be able to flip the lever back in time to survive. These ancient cities are filled with such mystical purpose and technology that even thousands of years on, man and Mer alike seek to reclaim their secrets. Hidden deep within these facilities, not even the Falmer can lay eyes upon them. Many buildings with metal-capped towers make up the ancient cities, the largest of which appearing in the underground caverns. The Dwemer put much of their pride here, below ground, though it seems much of it would surface as they continued to fight the other races all across Tamriel. The Dwemer Ruins of Skyrim take what was hinted at in Morrowind and ramp it up to 11. The structures are so large and spacious, the stone walls carved in intricate patterns. Metal braziers host mysterious green flames which seem to be fueled by a gas. There are so many cool little areas where researchers were at work here, improving on their time-tested designs and toiling away at never-ending goals. The entire Cavern of Blackreach, though I won't get into it here, is one of, if not my favorite location in all of Skyrim. Hell, maybe in all of the Elder Scrolls period. It's just a gorgeous area, and such a wonderful surprise. I remember the first time I found it when playing the game in 2011. I, being a Dwemer simp, walked my over-encumbered character through the entire underground region, taking every dwarven object I could. I had the perk to make me walk faster with the bow drawn. Between that and Whirlwind Sprint, I was able to loot every item in the underground region. However, it took so long to do so that things actually began to respawn. That was how I knew to leave with my spoils. I bet the Empire would have my head. But looking more directly at the ruins themselves, they offer such a diverse array of experiences. I know many people dislike the Falmer, but even they are an interesting lore introduction, if not very fun to fight at times. In terms of realism, the broken stone supports, spewing metal pipes, and so on are clear evidence of a city in disrepair. Even regular smugglers were able to best a handful of the automatons, which have been dormant for perhaps thousands of years prior to this excavation. The way these machines emerge from unseen pipes is a novel way to surprise the player with an encounter. What really does it for me though is the sheer size of the structures, the beauty of the buildings, and the evident work of a proud, multi-region faring people who were doomed to their own destruction. As I've spent more than a moment waxing upon some of my favorite histories, let's get into the details of the loot. Getting the basic stuff out of the way, we have bandits with regular armors, weapons, and small handfuls of gold. This is standard throughout many dungeons in Skyrim, and can lead to around 50 to 200 gold per bandit on average, depending on your skill in bartering. Although that number wavers, it can typically be expected. Far more interesting than this is the loot drawn from the Dwemer automatons, which includes soul gems, regular gems, and large hunks of metal. The soul gems suggest that there must be a magical source of energy for these machines, unlike in Morrowind, unless those were just not well expressed. The large pieces of metal can be smelted into dwarven ingots, which can then be used to forge Dwemer armors and weapons. Better yet, the size of the metal piece actually correlates to how many ingots you're able to smelt from it. That is just way too cool. Even though I usually wear light armor, I always make a set for the mannequin. The machines also contain stores of dwarven oil. This can be used to create potions which fortify one's skill in illusion magic, as well as restore and allow passive generation of magicka in general. As a final piece of loot from the constructs, you can find dynamo cores about the ruins. They're used as part of the internal system of the Steam Centurions, and can sell for over 100 gold apiece. They also just look super unique, so I tend to collect them. Moving on to everyone's favorite creatures of the depths, we will look at the Falmer. The typical weapons and armor are only worth a good amount of gold at higher levels. The prize loot here are the ears of the Falmer, which can be used to make poisons of health damage and frenzy. Also, strangely, they can be used to make potions that allow the drinker to resist poison, while also enhancing their lockpicking skill. The chorus beasts drop their chitin, which can be used to improve Falmer armor and weapons, should you want to use them. I like this detail. You can also harvest their eggs and use them to make potions of invisibility, which are incredibly useful, though the Falmer will still sense you one way or another. A common fungus within many caves throughout Skyrim are the glowing mushrooms. They can be used for a wide selection of beneficial properties, such as shock resistance or fortification and destruction magic, smithing, and health. Aside from creatures and ingredients, there are plenty containers throughout the ruins. Most of these have gems, jewelry, gold, and other expensive items that make their looting worthwhile as you work your way through the dungeons. They're often placed behind metal gates and within research rooms, which fits the style of the dwarves. Overall, I find the experience of the few Dwemer Ruins to be quite enjoyable. Yes, there are often Falmer that you have to battle, and yes, they can get annoying. Honestly, they creep me out more than anything. But the atmosphere, the entrances to Blackreach, and the thoughts of ancient halls filled with dwarves is just so intriguing. Every moment spent unearthing pieces of the effervescent mystery of the Dwemer is worth it to me. As is common in Tamriel, the surface of Skyrim is fraught with caves, a total of 70 or more. Many of them play nest to beasts or host to those who cannot find refuge elsewhere. This includes bandits, which happen to be held up here behind the waterfall. This cave is located east-northeast from High Hrothgar, decently far from the nearest settlement. The shining waters and verdant trees are a fine distraction from the warning placed out front, the Lost Knife bandits having impaled bodies on spikes. The gruesome sight would deter lesser adventurers from entering. Whereas caves in Vardenfell and Cyrodiil have hints at being formed through aquatic erosion, the event can be witnessed here in real time. A stream flows into the cave from the waterfall outside, carving a lower path over time. Roots of plants above hang from the ceiling, and a stalagnate leans over the water as if to watch its progress. Not too deep within the cave are a stack of crates, probably used to store lesser goods that the bandits have stolen. Nearby, 2 of them stand near a fire, food and drink sitting on a table. This alcove proves a cozy resting spot for murderers and thieves. They also brought potions with them, most likely pilfered from the corpses the highwaymen have created. The initial cavern may not have been impressive, but the central room is quite impeccable. Many waterfalls drop from walls throughout the cavern, their speed contrasting the slow, confident steps of the bandits as they walk across their custom wooden parapets. These hooligans are prepared to fire upon intruders from afar, and should the allure of diving into cave water prove too strong for that intruder, the bandits have prepared an ambush from below. The next area of the cave has somehow found its way into an old fort, providing an extra level of comfort and stability to the fiends living here. 2 have a friendly discussion at the dining table, while 1 mans the bar. In the past, this must have been a boon to soldiers' morale. Just who those soldiers were, we'll never know, though once we visit a proper ruined fort, we'll discuss ideas on who they may have been. Moving deeper into the cave, we find a scene representative of the Lost Knife Bandits' true depravity. Here on a table is a set of bones, including a human hand and foot. They're still fresh with bright blood. Either someone was severely punished here, or they were simply killed and torn apart. Bandits don't put much work into things other than murder and thievery. To me, this means the possibility of cannibalism is not off the table. Something else that isn't off the table is that bottle of skooma, which can further distort one's view of reality, possibly leading to the grotesque scene we find here today. To refute the idea of cannibalism, we can clearly see the bandits have found more than a decent supply of food, and are even in the process of baking potatoes and leeks. So, who knows? In a final chamber, we see the culmination of the bandits' work, a selection of large metal cages which once housed people or beasts. At the time being, there's only one such captive, a saber-toothed tiger. Blood is spilled all over the place, and bodies of bandits lay across the lower areas of the cave. This place was used as an arena where participants were forced to battle to the death. Perhaps they were saving the Sabertooth for the next unlucky wanderer. In a twist of fate, the Sabertooth can be released to attack its captors, but it's unfortunately outmatched by sheer number. The bandits here are quite strong, and one of them even used a magic staff, which is somewhat rare. After all these ne'er-do-wells have been defeated, the cave becomes a fascinating work of nature once more. Never again will something be forced into one of these cages, dreading the day it is forced to exit. Beginning our discussion on realism, I must highlight my favorite part of the cave. This stream, sourced from the exterior, both serves to connect the outside world to this location, and also provide a realistic and believable method of cavern formation. The fact that it sits lower than the rest of the walkway and flows ever downward with gravity is such a subtle and enjoyable detail. What is not subtle is the multitude of waterfalls pouring into the central cavern. Either way, this is still cool, but some of their sources do not appear above ground like this initial stream. There are also small deposits of different ores in the cave, including this iron vein. A trap of falling rocks awaits any traveler who passes under this walkway. Luckily, I was able to avoid it as the ground began to rumble. I really liked how the cave worked its way into an old fort, but I do wonder how this segment is so deep underground compared to the others. There is of course a tumble of boulders that's blocked off a stairway, so at least there's a hint at further structure. Releasing the Sabertooth is fun, though I wish it had survived long enough to help me fend off the bandits. It would be so cool if it helped you kill them, then just left you alone. The end of dungeon chest sits right up here behind where the boss was. Although it can be argued that it makes sense to hide good loot deep in the cave, it does not explain why every boss chest in any dungeon looks exactly the same, nor why this one contains basically nothing in terms of loot. Luckily, there's a better boss chest hidden within the smaller stream channel. It has a master lock though, and should not be confused with the primary chest they expect players to have access to. This one has a decent amount of value and rewards a player for increasing their lock-picking capability, so that's cool. The presence of dead bandits here suggests that all of them are eligible to be thrown in the ring, whether against their will or to prove themselves. There is no immunity. Also, there is no evidence to suggest that they have captured wanderers off the road for battles, as I posited early on, not to say it's impossible. The presence of a dead bear along with the Sabertooth suggests that they primarily captured animal combatants. Back in the Grand Cavern, there's a classic cave hidden beyond a waterfall. Resting on the ground is a random, leveled armor piece. Next to this is a chest containing a value summed up of around 300 gold. The loot of the bandits is not much to talk about, since we already covered their average values in the previous segment. And surprisingly, there were little to no native plants or fungi within the cave, meaning that this particular dungeon lacks that extra layer of depth. This is not representative of all caves in the game, but serves as a good example in all other categories. Typically, one will find lots of fungi in these dungeons from which to make poisons. The caves in Skyrim do have one fatal issue for me. Regardless of their size and the existence of sprint, they almost invariably have an easy out exit loop. In the case of this cave, it takes the shape of a very conveniently formed rock ledge, not even something the bandits themselves have created. This makes a lot of the caves, and dungeons in general, feel like they were made as a video game experience first and an immersive one last. which probably and understandably was the case. Still, in smaller dungeons, this is incredibly noticeable and often makes little sense. For the larger dungeons, I believe myself and many others are fine with their existence, so long as it makes some sort of sense compared to the rest of the structure, such as reaching the top of a building and finding a hole through rotten wood to fall below. Since caves are a dungeon found in all the titles we have discussed, I feel it's acceptable to place an opinion here. The level of detail and clutter and texture fidelity within Skyrim is really good compared to the other games. It would be super cool to experience the caves and loot styles of Morrowind with this scale. Throw in some traps from Oblivion, some Dunmer calling me expletives, and this would be the greatest dungeon type of all time. We can skip the CRM corner inside 01 and 2 though. Across the surface of Skyrim are 17 abandoned forts, each dating back to some time in the First Era. Just who lived in these forts is a subject of debate, but many point to the architectural similarities between these and Helgen, suggesting that they were originally hosted by members of the First Human Empire. These would have been constructed by a detachment of Needs, if so, meaning that this particular group of Needs had a more refined understanding of fortification than the fledgling Cyrodiilic societies. These forts may also have traded hands between Imperials and Ancient Nords over time, those feuds having been lost to history, at least until recently, where the flames have been stoked once more. Although many intact forts are manned in the Fourth Era, 17 of them were left crumbled and decrepit by some unknown battle in history. These were then infiltrated and controlled by parties of questionable morality. In the case of Felglow Keep, a set of ruins north-northeast of Whiterun, a large band of mages has taken over. Many of these are necromancers conducting vile practices that, surprisingly, are not new to the province of Skyrim. Outside the fort proper are the remainder of walls and support structures, across which a mage walks to keep guard. A quite literally flaming threat floats nearby, a flame Atronach, most likely summoned by one of the mages. Something's happening inside that cannot be disturbed or interrupted. Inside the door, one is immediately met with the dining area. Here, warriors used to share stories over dinner, preparing for their next battle with invaders of various origin. Now, green moss has taken over the stone in many areas. There's a constant rain of stone debris, small but volatile, kicking up dust all around. Fresh food sits on tables, clearly indicating a current host. Yet another dining hall exists, including a bar to ease the spirits of the soldiers who worked there. The nearby flames are tended by 2 necromancers. After battling their frosty talents, the adventurer finds a summoning circle where a conjurer planned on calling forth some sort of Daedric being. This, of course, could not be allowed to pass. In the other wing are resting areas, beds made of hay and animal pelts. Strangely, a rare briar heart sits upon a table. These are used by the Reachmen in rituals and may suggest a connection or budding alliance between those and the necromancers. In this upper room are both an enchanting and alchemy table. From these, harvested souls can be used to imbue objects with magical powers, and different ingredients can be combined to produce elixirs of wide-ranging properties. A strange gem floats within a case nearby, as well as a soul gem and a handful of ingots. A necromancer works on a metal weapon of some sort, fashioning a backup should he run out of magicka. The first floor was but a hint at the macabre activities taking place below. 3 holding cells sit, one including 2 wolves which are sure to meet a gruesome fate at the hands of these necromancers. Rather than allow them to starve or become skeletal hounds, it should be considered a mercy to put them out of their misery. In an old armory, mannequins are set up for target practice. 2 necromancers rest under the bulging, dangerous ceiling above. This hall is lined with tombs, each including the corpse of an ancient combatant who fell in his duties. As nothing is sacred, the necromancers have been practicing their ability to raise them from their slumber. From the tombs crawl skeletons, fighting for their new masters as they hide back like cowards. A few icicles impaling the adventurer is like a splinter in the palm of the carpenter. It comes with the job. In the far opposite direction of the dungeons is a room full of recent corpses and their purveyors. Here, the body of a Khajiit lays face down on a table. The necromancer has much to learn, as she has only brought life back to his tale. Many such gruesome sights can be seen here, with bloody bodies and bones strewn about the place. As these necromancers regard their newest quarry, a new surprise becomes apparent. Many of these dead bodies are in fact vampiric. In an additional set of cells, there are bodies of multiple slain vampires. At first glance, it may be surmised that these necromancers have done the world a favor, returning these blood fiends from whence they came. However, the truth is almost assuredly darker. This group, if successful, could resurrect all of these incredibly powerful subhumans, then bend them to their will. What is better than a dead body, if not one already infused with strong magics? As such, these necromancers cannot be allowed to survive. The unfortunate souls stored in these ruins must be put to rest, for good. This particular ruined fort was a large one, and although it lacked much exterior that others lay claim to, I find its catacombs and winding halls to do more than make up. The infestation of necromancers is a common occurrence within dungeons, as we have seen, But there was something that made this particular dungeon stick out to me. The necromancers made use of a few key details of the fort. For one, they used cells which previously housed ancient enemies of the Empire to hold their new quarry. They also used the catacombs area for easy skeletons on which to hone their craft, knowing they could summon them if routed by modern Imperial forces. Finally, they used the overall subterranean architecture to hide much of their practice from view, while using fortification of heavy stone walls as protection. After all, to the common adventurer passing by, they seemed only to be mages with matching cloaks. I think everything about this dungeon was used correctly. The one thing I found strange was the necromancer forging an iron weapon, but this was more due to the proximity to crafting stations and AI programming than to intention. There were also a couple traps at the end of the dungeon, including a rune and set of dart shooters. I believe there were also bear traps set for the skeevers in the waterlogged segment. That area was another easy out, which for this somewhat confusing layout of a dungeon was no real problem to me. In fact, I'm finding less examples that break immersion over time. They do not lack reason in most cases, but stand out like a sore thumb to anyone who's completed many dungeons in the game. Therefore, it may become a self-fulfilling prophecy for those who have many hours dedicated to the title. I also wanted to state that the pace of storytelling within the dungeon was great as well. Not one word was shared in conversation between the adventurer and the necromancers, but the environment told all that was needed. You begin on the surface seeing only a group of odd-looking mages. You enter to find they're trying to summon something. Then you see them raising a hall of skeletons and, finally, practicing their next goal of resurrecting a whole group of vampires. This little story exemplifies Bethesda's ability to make a dungeon unique without attributing a world-shattering event to it, or even dialogue that bashes the player over the head with, "Isn't that crazy?" The variety of mages also adds to the fun of the dungeon, which wasn't even in question for me. Each one had a different element, called some sort of skeleton, and so on. This was fun for a melee-based player to move through, cutting them down while they tried and failed to reduce me to ash. Now let's look at how the dungeon stands up on a loot-based approach. Each mage has a cloak that can sell for 150 gold, as well as some stuff worth around 500. That's a good amount of money per single enemy, and there are many in this dungeon. They sometimes have alchemical ingredients as well. There's also the Flame Atronach that I believe is guaranteed to spawn. It drops fire salts which can be used to both restore and regenerate magicka over time, while also providing resistance to fire. If one is a mage and comes across a dragon, this would be their go-to brew. Many other ingredients exist in the dungeon, but those are not a common loot item across the type as a whole. In this dungeon are many soul gems though, which are a relatively common find. In our first boss chest we find 200 gold, a random enchanted helmet worth 800, and a bow. This is a pretty good set of loot, but 1000 gold for a supposed boss chest can be a bit of a letdown. There's also a conjuration skill book here. The existence of the strange gem in this dungeon is, of course, not a given for each fort. I wanted to highlight the fact that I mentioned them as an interesting surprise, something I had forgotten about and not something one should expect within each fort dungeon. Underground we find a tome that allows one to raise undead. Upon the vampire bodies is vampire dust, which strangely creates potions with only positive effects, including invisibility, magicka restoration, health regeneration, and, strangest of all, a cure for common disease. All of these made immediate sense to me, but the last one took a second, until I realized if you have diseases like porphyric hemophilia or noxophilic sanguivoria, which means you're a vampire, then other diseases cannot taint your already tainted blood. How interesting. It's strange that you can eat the ashes of a vampire and not contract their disease, but instead eating it will cure you, if it's in the early stages. Other than the loot described, there's often a selection of potions, randomized ingredients, and so on. These dungeons are almost always worth the loot. I also appreciate that the detachment of Needs which explored these lands in ancient times actually knew how to build a proper fort. This is an improvement on the unfortunate state of the fort dungeon type within the previous title. Now let's see if mining dungeons got the same treatment. Skyrim is known for its cold climate, strong warriors, and deeply historied battles with the other races of Tamriel. This adventurer suggests a contender for what this land should be known for, and perhaps, why the Empire really wants to maintain control of it. There are 22 mines in Skyrim, each containing ore of various types. This ore can be refined and used in conjunction with leather and other materials to create weapons, armor, and even jewelry. But each piece of smithed gear begins as a chunk of mineral in a rock, its value apparent only when carved out by a metal pick. And where does this happen but in a mine? As an example, one could visit the Biogulch mine. Situated south and over the mountain from Rorikstead, this mine was carved out by a gang of orc bandits. Their distinctive architecture is visible in the walls which contain the mine, as well as small awnings and other buildings. We'll see why it is exclusively run by orcs soon enough. Here sit some of the weapons they created, fashioned from the same wood that surrounds the settlement. It appears they carry timber into the center of the courtyard, such as this piece, for processing. Up the wooden stairs, one will find a high ledge upon which are a few things of interest. 1. The mine entrance itself is carved into the rock face. 2. A forge with all the necessary amenities is just by the mine, making for quick and efficient ore-to-armor processing. 3rd, there is a small walkway with a gorgeous view. It looks out upon the southern fringes of not only Falkreath Hold, but Skyrim itself. Just over those mountains are the northern reaches of Cyrodiil, and the mountain range itself contains many important locations of that province, such as Bruma and the fabled Cloud Ruler Temple. The open sky, clouds, and verdant trees almost distract entirely from the other beauty here. Of course, that is underground. The settlers here do happen to be bandits, so they don't take kindly to wanderers visiting the site of their next capital venture. Inside the mine itself, one can see wooden scaffolding, ropes hung for lanterns, and also bone chimes, there for making any intrusion immediately recognized. Just beyond the chimes are a wheelbarrow and a pick. Just beyond that is a rock full of orichalcum ore, visibly green. Beside this narrow segment is a small crate of ale and mugs, a certain boost on difficult days. They may also explain why none of this ore is currently picked clean. Further down the cavern hall is a large chest, presumably where the orcs store their goods from pillaged towns and travelers on the road. One light shines upon this back section, hosting a dining table, a keg, and a small bedroll. More orichalcum deposits can be found all over the place, a green sheen plainly evident. Further down the cavern, the bandit leader walks in his strong mail. A new breakthrough area full of ore deposits sits just behind him. There's a lantern on a post suggesting their next target area to branch into. Just outside this room is a table with mining tools upon it, suggesting they may have all taken a break at the time the adventurer arrived. The bandit chief is just as aggressive as those outside. When defeated, he gets a really good view of the barrow that will now carry his loot for someone else. The orichalcum mine being run by a full squad of orc bandits is a really cool idea. How they learned of the deposit is unknown, but this ore is important to orcs specifically because it's used to create orcish armor. The armor is quite heavy and strong and retains a greenish tint. It's emblematic of the orcs as a race, owning a unique style of curves and jagged edges, fantastic for battles to the death. The ore alone is the primary draw to this location, but we should look over the rest of the loot as well. The bandits all drop a sum value of around 200 gold, which we've come to expect as standard. Across the settlement are also pieces of orcish gear which may be randomized, but seeing as this is the theme of the location, I don't believe they are. Small chests sit here and there containing a combined 50 to 200 gold worth of objects, nothing too noteworthy. The bandit chief has gear totaling 2600 or so, not bad at all for such a small dungeon. The size of this location was also a deliberate choice, as I wanted to express the primary point of value, which I do have more to say about in a moment. The boss chest, opened by the bandit leader's key, had a diamond and not much else. Perhaps 1,000 gold can be expected here. But now I want to focus solely on the ore. After clearing out the entire small mine, I ended up with 27 orichalcum ore. This becomes 13 ingots with which to create strong and valuable armor and weapons. But let us create a more holistic view of Skyrim's mines in general. In the province of Skyrim, there are 9 different types of ores to mine. They include things as exotic as malachite and moonstone, and can be used to make armor such as glass, elven, steel, ebony, and so on. Not only does Skyrim have fully operable and, in some cases, officially operational mines, but they also provide an absolutely incredible range of minerals when you consider it. Vvardenfell, which at this point is unfortunately covered in seas of ash, is known only to be home to malachite, ebony, and diamond deposits. Cyrodiil has only iron, silver, and gold. Skyrim has more types of ores and in higher number than either of those two provinces combined. It's reflected in the shops across Skyrim, in the quantity of forges, and in the various types of armors people can regularly be seen wearing. It is, quite simply, astounding. Now, from a gameplay perspective, I want to highlight a few shining details. In the previous 2 games, there were 2 sets of armor that the player could, having supplied the resources, commission a smith to create. There was 1 light armor variety and 1 heavy armor variety per game. Skyrim allows you to physically toil for the material, smelt it into ingots, and combine it with other resources you hunted down in order to create your own armaments. Not only that, but you can improve them at different stations as well. You can even make jewelry should you be interested in fashion. For all the above reasons, these mines easily surpass either the Morrowind or Oblivion counterparts. It's really no contest. Not only that, but in the exterior of this very mine is one of the many components necessary to build a home in the region. Quarried stone is often found within or near these mines, another great reason to visit them at any opportunity. Beyond simply making things for oneself, gear could also be made for shops and sold for great amounts of coin. The benefits cannot be overstated. That said, I believe this is another reason the Empire is so focused on maintaining control of the region. Not only do they want peace in the region, a topic of debate, but they also want sovereignty over the economic values in this province. It's not a far stretch to assume. I was surprised to find myself so intrigued by Skyrim's mines, even the small one here. But the interaction is great for world building, and makes one feel much closer to their gear because they actually worked for it. The mine seemed as though it was actively being worked in, with different paths planned for the next dig. This is very cool stuff, and I can only hope that there will be more interactable skills like mining and smithing in the future. Perhaps we could revisit spellmaking, requiring the acquisition of certain crystals or essences from the land before a certain property could be learned. This would open various paths, many of which great, some of which dark. But, as we've seen with the fort we visited, the dark arts of magic are still very much alive in the region today. So too were they in ancient times. To demonstrate this, we need only visit an ancient Nordic ruin. Luckily for us, this is next on the itinerary. As with the Dunmer, the Nords are known to bury their dead in subterranean tombs. These locations are also protected by the dead, another similarity. However, the story here is a little different, and the tombs are much larger. There are 38 Nordic ruins on the surface of Skyrim. Located in the Druidic Mountains, the tomb known as Valthum contains a great deal of history. In it lies the remains of a dragon priest known as Evnerak. The dragon priests were a group of high-ranking people who revered the dragons as their superiors in ancient times. They betrayed the other locals, and swore fealty to those great winged beasts, aiding in their near-total domination of the land of Skyrim. There was a great dragon war in the Merethic era, one which luckily ended in humanity's favor. The Nords, as well as some dragons who chose to aid them, fought against the Vane dragons and their vile priests. Eventually, most dragons were driven from the land, and the followers of the dragon cult were chased into small dens they had constructed, many of which comprised the Nordic tombs we see today. Occasionally they would find and bury a dragon in a mound, awaiting a far-off day when the dragons would arise once more. Those who survived the war stayed in the ruins with their priest, and most committed ritual, word I can't say, dying alongside their leader so that they may one day come back in force. The result of millennia on their decaying bodies has not been kind. The barest hint of life remains in the ghostly blue eyes of what we now call the Draugr. Imbued with great dark magic, they stalk the halls of the ruins restlessly. Each and every night they exit the tombs, walk to the coffin of their dragon priest, and prostrate themselves before it. Then, as scholar Bernadette Banting describes, there's a flow of aura from the Draugr into the dragon priest's body. This aura is of unknown origin and seems to renew within the Draugr during the day, for they have consistently kept up this routine for thousands of years. Along with maintaining the life force of their ruler, they also keep the braziers lit, gather food from unfortunate adventurers, and so on. This explains the relatively lively atmosphere, strange in such a morbid place. As mentioned, the Draugr protect these ruins from any outsiders. They vary in talents, some wielding magic while others swing axes, for example. Concerning Evnerak himself, we'll have to look to modern matters. Upon entering the ruins, the adventurer is spoken to by the ghost of Valdar, an ancient Nord who swore his life, and his death, to prevent Evnerak from ever escaping. He feels his energy is dwindling, and so, asks the adventurer to make sure this threat is forever subdued. The dragon priest Evnerak, before lichhood, had his blood drained and placed within different vials. This was done so that he could, upon returning after death, be re-imbued with his lively blood, thus strengthening his power. This could not be allowed to happen, lest Evnerak begin another dragon war. The spirit of Valdar requests that the adventurer gather and spill out these vials, so that the priest will never achieve his plans. Thus, the quest through Valthum began. The tomb has been falling apart for centuries, and strangely contains mammoth bones, suggesting that the beast was either killed before the place was built, or it was dragged here in pieces as food. Maybe the Draugr even did it, salting and preparing food in the case of their leader's return. Almost immediately into the ruins we see the tomb of Evnerak, a singular coffin block with reverent statues surrounding it. Just beyond is his ancient throne, which he once sat upon while relaying the orders of his dragon god kings. Some passages in the ruin have crumbled apart, unfortunately taking with them various Draugr. On top of the Draugr themselves, there are also ancient traps and pressure plates set throughout the place. Rooms full of embalming tools exist. Flames light the rooms for this delicate work to take place. According to Bantian of the College of Winterhold, the Draugr looked as alive as you or I during their initial transformation. There would be no noticing whether they were actually dead should they have been visited early on. However, other accounts say that the Draugr were embalmed using these tools, ensuring that they could maintain at least some of their hardened matter as they decayed over time. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. A spiritual shade of Evnerak can be seen watching over an ancient meeting room. It quickly disappears, as if leading the adventurer to surer doom. Here one can see a room full of alchemical experimentation. On the shelves are potions and ingredients, and along the wall is an alchemy table conspicuously similar to those used today. A little while later, one comes across a room full of spiderwebs and egg cases. A trap chest sits on the floor, somehow connected to a trapdoor above, which releases whatever spiders exist inside. After the spider is dealt with, sacrificial bodies can be seen hanging from the dragon statues. Were these fed to the spiders? Were they Nordic prisoners? I assumed they would have to be, seeing as how Evnerak would want as many worthy followers as possible upon his resurrection. One by one, the adventurer gathers the vials of Evnerak's blood, each time incurring a vicious response from the guarding Draugr. For the last vial, a great ruined door is in the way. Upon a pedestal is the Iron Dragon Claw, in the palm of which is the code to unlock the path. Directly through this door is the final vial, as well as a word wall. These word walls contained ancient magic bestowed upon the followers of the dragons. If one were dragonborn, they could absorb this mystical knowledge and use it against their enemies. It stands to reason, then, that many of the Draugr in the tomb are gifted with the voice, able to use shouts to combat any intruders. After retrieving the final vial, the adventurer returns to the initial chamber. Working with the spirit of Valdar, they pour out all the blood and waste it. Then they sit upon Evnerak's throne, enraging him to the point of an early resurrection. The Great Lich rises, ready to destroy this mortal interruption. Unfortunately for him, this adventurer surpasses the abilities of his weakened state. With his death, the worry of Evnerak's potential army is no more, and Valdar, the noble hero who sacrificed his very essence to guard the place, is finally allowed to rest. As far as a general example of the Nordic Ruin dungeon type, there is almost no better choice than Valthum. There's a decent enemy variety, traps, the use of a dragon claw, a word of power, a battle with a dragon priest, and, of course, a set of ancient lore that adds to the overall Skyrim experience. Before we get into the loot and so on, I'd like to discuss a few things. For one, the Draugr of Skyrim are different than the cursed Draugr we see in Solstheim in the Third Era. Those were cursed by Shor for their cannibalism, however necessary it may have been to survive. The Draugr shown in this segment willingly went to their fate out of zealous fanaticism for their cultish cause. The fact that the Draugr awake nightly and maintain the tombs is a good detail, as I always wondered how things seemed to be in such a relatively decent state. When it comes to the fresh food, my only thought is that it was preserved through their magic or reclaimed from previous intruders. And as for how their magic regenerates night after night, there's no telling. Some say they have only awakened during the recent crisis brought by Alduin's return, but many other sources state that they've been performing these routines for centuries. I'm inclined to believe the latter. The lack of information behind this recurring power source is a plot hole in my view, something that needs to be explained later. The magic must be incredibly powerful. The fact that the Draugr can shout also makes the player feel a little more grounded and less special. This is pretty much the only case in which this happens within the Elder Scrolls V, as the entire game is a power fantasy in which you become incredibly strong in no time flat. I appreciate this, and it also calls back to the history from which your bloodline comes. A people able to speak the words of the dragons and use their own magic against them. I also like how they often pop out of tombs before attacking, which is a cool detail. Although there are many good things about this dungeon, I need to point out some things that disturb the realism factor. For one, there's the trap with the spider. A chest is placed and trapped, which somehow connects to that spider trap far in the ceiling. How did this happen? Have the Draugr been breeding the spiders? How do they control them? Are they always fed with outsiders? There are many questions here. The trap itself seems like it was placed by someone of full mind, not a near mindless husk that roams and attacks whatever moves. Next, there's the Dragon Claw puzzle. This comment will go for every claw puzzle. Although they are neat at first and add a little mix-up to the run and gun playstyle of the game, they are unbelievably simple. How is one to believe that no one cracked the code before them? Surely the player is not the first person to make it this far in each of the dungeons. Beyond that is the word wall, which I can understand being walled off and contained deep in the ruins. What I don't understand is why there's a large boss chest, all of this type which should be remodeled to at least fit the dungeon aesthetic, that rests here at the end of the dungeon as an obvious reward. Just after this is another loop back to the start, with a single board having held the door shut. If this were done by Evnerak's Chosen, it surely would have been bound with magic or otherwise guarded by the best Draugr available. Getting back to the battle with Evnerak, I have to admit some disappointment. There should have been Draugr pouring out of every point in the room as I tried to defeat their master. Evnerak used electric spells only, and, although in a weakened state, should have been much more interesting to fight. I do like the trope of completing an ancient ghost's business and allowing them to rest. It's always satisfying. Now to the loot of the Nordic Ruins. The Draugr drop small amounts of gold, ancient armaments, gems, and so on. These typically add up to 100 or more gold. There's also small urns everywhere which almost always have a few gold pieces in them. The higher level Draugr can carry expensive weapons, sometimes enchanted. The chests are pretty standard, having a handful of gold and maybe an expensive gem or weapon. Sometimes they can contain around 1,000 gold worth of loot. The boss chest contained items totaling over 10,000 gold, which was very good. The word wall imbues the reader with the ability to shout an aura whisper, seeing magical auras of animated beings around them. Finally, we have the reward from Evnerak. His loot is worth about 3,000 gold, and the mask allows the wearer immunity to both disease and poison. This mask, created by the dragons themselves, is important as well as useful. When brought to the dragon cult capital of Brahminar, along with 7 other masks, a final one called Konarik is unlocked. This mask belonged to an unknown priest, and allows the wearer many effects should they fall to low health. An explosion of fire will surround them, a great aura of healing will invigorate them, and there's even the potential for a spectral dragon priest to appear and aid them in battle, perhaps the spirit of Konarik themselves. This helmet also has the highest based armor rating in the game for helmets, and cannot be obtained without getting Evnerak and all the other masks. This optional set of goals is something rarely seen in Skyrim, and a welcome addition to the various things you can do in the game. We also have a handful of ingredients to expect within the ruins. For one, there's an ample supply of bone meal, which can be used to make potions of fire resistance and conjuration, a boon to any necromancers, including the dragon priests themselves who want to raise an undead army. There are also the spider eggs, which can fortify lockpicking and marksman skills, or be made into poisons of stamina and magic damage. Finally, there are often different mushrooms to be found in ruins, such as the imp stool, which can restore health but is often used in strong poisons of health damage, lingering health damage, and paralysis. One can expect to make a great deal of gold from visiting these ruins should they survive the experience. The lore introduced by these dungeons also aids in Skyrim's world building, providing ancient histories through which the Dragonborn can connect to their mysterious heritage. And with that, the dungeons of Skyrim are completed. However, there are 2 other types of dungeons that can be reached in the far-off, yet familiar, lands of Solstheim. As much as it pains a dark elf to look upon their ashened homeland, someone must be there to clear what remains of evil. Taking a boat from Windhelm, a traveler can visit the unfortunate wastes of what used to be the frosty and vibrant island of Solstheim. Now it's a refuge for many Dunmer who were displaced by the eruption of Red Mountain. In the distance, the spewing ash of the mountain can still be seen. It's an unfortunate time for the Dunmer indeed. Not only did they suffer from the Oblivion crisis, but they were also immediately invaded by the Argonians, a race with which they have a long and upsetting history. Soon after the tribunal lord, Vivek disappeared to some unknown location, and the meteor Bardow was no longer held at bay by his magic. His promise to his people was finally proven false, and Bardow struck with momentum as though it had never been impeded. Thus the Red Year began, killing many Dunmer and sending the survivors in a mass exodus to regions beyond. The ash has even reached Solstheim, a territory once developed by the Imperials, now in the hands of the Dunmer. Across Solstheim there are various caves, 9 in fact, that have yet to be explored, as the refugees simply want to be left alone for once in their lives. As such, it falls to adventurers to clear them of potential dangers. As the Nerevarine did in the Third Era, the Dragonborn decided to visit the cave called Ben-Congarag. This cave sits in the northern reaches of the island and is often blanketed by snow. Frost trolls abound, and there are strange tapestries and markings outside the entrance. Wandering inside, one is met with a freezing, snow-filled cavern with icicles hanging dangerously from above. This cave is clearly inhabited with small dwellings and bones strewn about. In one open segment of the cave are a group of Reeklings, small blue goblins with a primitive society. They fear not the cold of Solstheim and, in fact, have lived here for centuries. They fashion weapons from spears and ride tusked hogs into battle. They also hoard goods like rats, piling them in corners or containers. Occasionally they get their hands upon something expensive, such as this statue of Dibella. They're relatively skilled craftsmen as well, making their own bridges, barricades, and even traps for the unwary traveler. Strangely, this cave finds itself dug into an ancient Nordic ruin, one which the Reeklings have of course explored. In a tomb is a body encased in Stalrim, a magical ice seen almost exclusively on the island of Solstheim. This was thought to protect the body from any sort of magic, including necromancy. This calls to question why many of the bodies of ruins in Skyrim, even those not interring dragon priests, had not adopted this policy. There is also a word wall here, as well as something more sinister we'll have to look at a bit later. This cave is pretty simple, but it's leaps and bounds better than most ice caves in Morrowind's Solstheim. This one also connects to the ancient Nordic ruin, which makes sense but was not seen in the Third Era rendition. To me, this just means that the Reeklings did a lot more digging over 200 years and happened to find it. Speaking of the Reeklings, they're strange but interesting to fight. They often fling spears which are small enough to be used by the player when drawn from a bow. This highlights the size difference between one and the cave's inhabitants. The Reeklings also pop up from different patches of snow or containers, surprising the player in an ambush. If triggered, the claw traps would be a devastating blow to an average-sized man or mer, something these Reeklings are smart enough to understand. Inside the ruins is a huge collection of both volumes of the lusty Argonian Maid. I didn't see any obvious females of the Reekling species, so I suppose these ones have to make do. Battling the Reekling on Tuskback was a nice flashback to Morrowind's take on Solstheim, but at least these Reeklings are not incredibly overpowered. The word wall in this dungeon teaches part of the Cyclone Shout, which forms a tornado of wind which blows through enemy forces. This word wall seems out of place here as there are very few burials I see, and certainly nothing as obvious as a dragon priest's decadent tomb, so I'm unsure why a random ruin would have a wall in it if it were not connected to the dragon cult. When it comes to loot, it basically matches that of a regular cave or ruined dungeon. The most notable things here, apart from the word wall, are a black soul gem filled with the Grand Soul, probably randomized, the lusty Argonian maid books, and the boar tusks, which can make potions of health and block fortification. They can also be used to make stamina potions, which could connect to real-life myths surrounding ivory and its use as an aphrodisiac. Overall, the ice caves are unremarkable, but better and more lively representations of the dungeon type than the Morrowind counterparts. Now, there was one more thing left in the cave. A mysterious book that I did not know if I should touch, but it's just so alluring. Surely one peek couldn't hurt. Opening one of the black books is a big mistake, should one not be ready for its dangers. These books are the gateways into the Oblivion realm of Maes Morra, Daedric Prince of Knowledge and Fate. He appears in the form of eyes and tentacles, and his realm is similarly expressed. First entry will find one looking at walls of books, floors made of paper, and ancient tomes spiraling about. Great pillars of books twist this way and that over a never-ending green sea of Creatia, otherwise known as uniformed chaos, inside which are the tentacles of some unknown beast. The sky is a nebulous green with streams of knowledge ever coursing across its great expanse. Creatures known as lurkers spawn from deep pools of black Creatia, standing at a gargantuan height. Their faces are reminiscent of deep-sea anglerfish, with giant soulless eyes and merciless rows of sharp teeth. They arise to stop the unworthy from uncovering the secrets of ancient and powerful texts. The realm also contains seekers, those who gather knowledge from the minds of their enemies, and who store it away amongst the countless novels in this demonic library. Traveling through the realm requires one to read more occult texts, which transport them across the vast sea and onto the nearby platform. The lurkers are able to spew tentacles of Creatia toward intruders, adding another weapon to their vicious arsenal. The Seekers aim to drain the life from invaders as they attack, and can turn themselves invisible while spawning decoys in order to get a better angle. There are long, shifting hallways that lead travelers to and from their destinations, testing them against Great Lurker Vindicators, allowing them to prove themselves worthy of the Black Book's hidden knowledge. If they are victorious, Maes Morra will allow them one of 3 powers per book, of which 8 are known to exist on the island of Skyrim. Only 6 of these books contain the abilities. In this case, the adventurer is offered a Dremora Merchant, Dremora Butler, or a Bardic Drum which increases the power of them and their allies. Each black book also shares only the first hint of the contained story before pulling you in. In the case of this book, Untold Legends, the following passage can be read. As the great ships of men crawled the waves to their destinies, there were, after long years, a number of tales lost in the mists of morning. Even after the forgetting, though, wisps of story find ways to receptive ears, as even the deepest of secrets never truly dies. When fires burn and the night grows soft and by that last part, you're sucked into the book. Reading the book while inside the realm also allows the adventurer to return to the snowy mountains of Solstheim, or wherever they may have been. Some may have noticed I neglected to mention why Maes Morra is in the realm. That is because I do not want to spoil the expansion for those who are new to it. Yes, even over a decade later. Looking at the visual design of these dungeons, the team could not have done a better job. There are endless seas of knowledge, storms of knowledge, pillars and walls of knowledge, more than any mortal could hope to retain even if they did have time to read them all. I also really like the green theme, which goes nicely with the blacks and browns to make the place simultaneously beautiful and horrifying. The aquatic theme of the creatures, tentacles, ocean of knowledge, and so on was another fantastic choice. On Earth, we've only explored 5% of our oceans, which make up over 70% of our planet. The missing knowledge is vast, almost as vast as the ocean itself. That sentiment ties in wonderfully with the mysterious trickster Maes Morra and his realm of forbidden information. Many come to follow this prince because they want to learn mystical secrets which will propel them ahead of their enemies. Unfortunately for them, this knowledge comes with a price, and many go insane as they learn facts no man or mer was ever meant to uncover. Random note, this scry object, scry meaning to see the future, allows you to physically enter a new area. Not sure if that was meant to be a connection, but it's cool nonetheless. I also believe these orange orbs are just recolored chorus eggs. The fighting styles of the 2 types of Daedra are fairly unique, especially when it comes to the lurkers. Sapping your stamina and so on is a dastardly tactic, but the presence of refill pillars helps against this. I could see myself visiting Apocrypha quite often, uncovering many secrets and using them for the betterment of Nirn. However, the information is known to corrupt regardless of if you are aware of the dangers. As Frank Herbert said, the most perfect barrier to learning a thing is the belief that it is already known. Now, before I continue waxing on end about Mora, let's look at the loot from these dungeons. Across this realm are many soul gems, books of various wear, and magical scrolls. There are also gems and such within the chests. When it comes to the enemies, lurkers often drop a great sum of gold, as well as randomized jewelry and ingredients relative to aquatic creatures such as slaughterfish eggs and so on. In this case, the lurker had only 286 gold in a silver necklace, the combination worth about 1,000 gold. Seekers tend to drop books, scrolls, and spell tomes. Spawning at Conjuration level 40 is a tome which allows a user to summon their own lurker, which I find to be very cool. Then again, I've always loved the Conjuration skill within the Elder Scrolls games. No, I'm not a necromancer, I swear, as long as my name is Sharn Grimuzgob. Among the powers granted by the Black Books are some truly wild abilities. Some examples include enhancing your shouts, removing friendly fire on companions, fortifying skills, shielding you from damage, and so on. On top of all the shouts, spells, weapons, potions, scrolls, racial abilities, etc., this adds yet another layer upon the near-invincible power of the Dragonborn. These dungeons are usually short and sweet, not overstaying their welcome, but providing a cool and unique experience each time, as well as the amazing benefits we've discussed above. After surviving that terrifying experience, I don't think I'll be visiting again anytime soon. I'll keep a hold of the book though, you know, for safekeeping. I wouldn't want anyone else to suffer the same fate. The Elder Scrolls V Skyrim was created by a team of 100 people. Of these, there were 7 level designers. Jeff Brown, Daryl Brigner, Joel Burgess, which we have discussed, Steve Cornett, Ryan Jenkins, Andrew Langlois, and Justin Schramm. There were undoubtedly many others who made these dungeons a reality, such as those who designed the visual art, the story behind the dungeon types, and so on. The names above built Skyrim within something called the Creation Engine, a more responsive and easy-to-use system than the construction kits of the earlier 2 games. In it, the placement of objects, lighting, scripting, and so on were carried out to provide us with the amazing game we know to be Skyrim. The dungeons all feel grounded within the lore of the region. They have a good level of replayability, which is important as the game itself, and this is an opinion, but the game itself only has replay value insofar as the playstyle of the character, which always ends up being a stealth archer. Unlike Morrowind, you can do every quest on a single playthrough. This means you only replay the game if you want to use a different race, weapon type, so on. Hence, the dungeons being replayable is very important. As I mentioned at the start, the aim of this video was to show the generic examples of each dungeon, and give a good representation of the type while avoiding quests and other things that could change the experience. Some dungeons, like the Lost Knife Hideout and Fellow Keep, have quests associated with them, but fill with different enemies when those quests are not taken. At first it sounds strange, but honestly, it's much better than leaving them locked with no key or something. To prevent players from repeating the total experience, there's often a walled off area within the dungeon that only opens once the related quest is underway. Hence, you can replay the dungeon while also having an extended version of it. I also want to say that the visual design of all the caves is fantastic. There have been major advancements since the original games in the series, and to see this growth is simultaneously astounding and something I've come to expect from Bethesda. The main quest dungeons, although not shown, should also have a mention here. They have segments which require the player to use shouts in order to pass through them. This was a cool idea and made the progression feel like it made sense. These shout-dependent locations were left out of regular dungeons though, and this makes sense because having many areas blocked off would be a huge restriction on player choice. As far as downsides of Skyrim's dungeons, I do find the small amount of types to be repetitive. Many of the caves blur together, and the same goes for the forts. Perhaps worst in all of these dungeons is the easy out system we've discussed. Many of them make sense, but there are plenty cases where they don't, and any immersion you are feeling toward the middle of the experience is easily washed away. There are a few downsides though, with most of the game being incredibly fun, interesting, and clearly successful. Skyrim gets a lot of flack for certain things, such as its heavy streamlining, writing, and so on, but hopefully here today I've given you some positives to recall. Here we are at the end of the journey, having visited all these different dungeons through the souls of various heroes. It really was a journey, taking in every detail, every placement, every piece of world building. This will be a short segment, but I felt I should point out some of my opinions so as to make any bias clear. Keep in mind these are opinions, so you can feel free to disagree as none of these are proven fact. You may actually change my mind about some of them if you'd like to comment your opinion below. Now, on to the segment. I began with Morrowind and always have nostalgia for it. Do I think the amount of types of dungeons makes it better than the other games? Not alone, no. As a matter of fact, although I prefer Morrowind, it's not better or worse than either of the other titles discussed today. Each has its own benefits and detriments. As it pertains to dungeons, here are some quick thoughts. Morrowind had more dungeon types, each of which being formed realistically and used to build the world many have come to love. There are almost always good amounts of loot to grab along the way. The full range of alchemical properties also aids in this valuation of the loot. Just about every cave is immensely fun for me to run through, barring of course most of the ice caves in Solstheim, which Skyrim's Dragonborn DLC did much justice to in terms of revamping. The Dwemer Ruins were full of unique historical accounts and plans, which added to one of the longest running mysteries in the series, and one that fully enthralls me. Looking at Oblivion, the Ayleid Ruins are by far the most interesting. The addition of traps and dungeon-specific music was also a great choice, and that's clear, as it maintained through Skyrim. However, having experienced all of these titles now, I must admit that the dungeons in Oblivion are lackluster. The caves are repetitive, with too many bullet sponge enemies, which is a problem with the game overall, strange loot placement, and nearly empty loot at that. The placement of randomized magical equipment is great for gold, but not for immersion. The forts can be fun, but are confusing in terms of realism. The mines can barely be considered mines, they may as well be called caves. Even the realms of Oblivion become a chore at a certain point, and can be somewhat annoying to get through. The caves and ruins of the Shivering Isles, though, bring back some of the alienness that I loved in Morrowind, and are something to look forward to during playthroughs of the base game. I think something that Oblivion suffers from is being streamlined into a medieval knight fantasy, whereas Morrowind was very foreign and unique. The sudden shift was jarring for me when I was younger, and reviewing all the differences now, it seems I'm not alone in that sentiment. Still, I really love Oblivion for a host of reasons, and I don't mean to bash it. Skyrim's dungeons can be very samey. However, they're almost always rewarding, if sometimes... You good, Mallow? However, they're almost always rewarding, if sometimes unrealistic. The mines are absolutely incredible, far better than either of the previous two games. The inclusion of crafting and creating your own armor from scratch is just plain awesome. Put it in the books, Skyrim has something over Morrowind. The caves in Skyrim remind me of what Morrowind's caves may have been like with modern tech. It's difficult to compare the two, but I will say each of those are better than those in Oblivion. Skyrim's ice caves are far better than those in Morrowind, even though I love Castle Karstag. I made it a point to use Ben Congerike in both the Morrowind and Skyrim segment, just so it could be seen how much improvement was made. As I mentioned, this is a short segment. These are my opinions as they stand after hours of playing, recording, researching, and writing about the dungeons to produce the product you are watching now. I would also love to hear your thoughts and opinions down below. The Dungeons of the Elder Scrolls. What a concept. Each of these games, these dungeons, these items were placed by people like you and I, fans of fantasy and lore. They've given us countless hours of enjoyment and intellectual stimulation. No, really, I mean it. The fact that they also make their world creation tools available to the public is beyond cool. After spending all this time in Tamriel, it's got me to thinking about what might come next. It's looking like we'll be visiting Hammerfell, a location full of interesting lore. Of course we'll have caves, probably Dwemer Ruins, and so on, but who knows what else? We've certainly had years since the trailer to dream. While making this video, I learned quite a bit about the different histories, the previous empires of Tamriel, the Ayleids, and so on. At some point in the future, I would really like to discuss all that, but for now, the untarnished lands of Vvardenfell are calling me. I want to thank all of you for watching, listening, and making this project worthwhile. I love the Elder Scrolls and have always wanted to give back in some way. Apart from my own personal stories that I'm working on, this seemed like the best method. If you found this video informative, entertaining, or otherwise got value from it, I invite you to subscribe to the channel for more. Liking the video is also really helpful, as it tells YouTube to recommend it to others, that way this information can be spread and shared with the community. If you're so inclined, I also have a Patreon where I post updates on videos, things from my personal life, other projects that don't fit the channel, and so on. The link is in the description and on the main page for the channel. A special thanks goes out to all at Bethesda who worked on these games over the years, the unofficial Elder Scrolls pages for help and additional research, and also Dean Colopy, my first patron. Much appreciated. With that, I'll see you guys next time. Bye.